They say a king chooses his queen for power, but what happens when he picks the one woman the world deemed worthless? Tonight, you're about to witness a collision between ruthless ambition and raw, unfiltered truth. A story where survival isn't about perfection, it's about refusing to break. Stick around till the end, because this empire is about to burn in ways you never saw coming. Drop a like and comment your city below. Let me know where my tribe is watching from. Wag. The Palace of Arendor didn't just exist, it threatened. Gold-veined marble rose in columns that could crush a man's spirit before his body, and every chandelier dripped light like blood from a fresh wound. This wasn't architecture. This was a declaration of dominance carved into stone and polished until it blinded. King Varion Thorn stood at the center of the great hall with the posture of a man who'd forgotten what mercy felt like. Broad shoulders beneath black and crimson silk, jaw carved from the same unforgiving granite as his reputation. His eyes, gray as winter storms, swept across the assembled nobility with the detached assessment of a butcher selecting meat. Tonight was the selection, not a ball, not a celebration, a transaction dressed in ceremony. Dozens of women stood in formation along the hall's edges, each one a carefully constructed weapon wrapped in silk and ambition. Daughters of dukes, nieces of warlords, every single one trained since birth for this exact moment, to become the blade that their family would slip between the king's ribs and call it love. Lady Seraphine Valdris stood at the front, spine straight as a sword, emerald gown cut to display power rather than flesh. Her smile was porcelain, beautiful and breakable, and hiding something far sharper underneath. Behind her, Lady Morgana Kest wore midnight blue that seemed to swallow light. Her father controlled the eastern mining territories. One word from her could starve the capital of iron within a month. Then there was Duchess Callista Vane, who'd allegedly poisoned her first husband and made it look like indigestion. Her dress was white. The audacity alone was impressive. But Varion's gaze didn't linger on any of them, because at the very back of the hall, half hidden behind a marble pillar, like she was trying to dissolve into the architecture itself, stood a girl who shouldn't have been there at all. Elira Vance. Plain brown dress. No jewelry. Hair pulled back in a braid so simple it might as well have been an insult to every other woman in the room. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white, and her eyes, dark as river stones, were fixed firmly on the floor like she was trying to will herself invisible. She wasn't a contender. She was a mistake. Her presence here was a bureaucratic accident, the result of some minor noble family technically meeting the requirements but lacking the sense to keep their unwanted daughter home. The Vances were barely gentry. Elira's father managed grain shipments. Her mother had died when she was 7. She had no dowry worth mentioning, no political connections that mattered, and absolutely no business standing in a room full of women who'd been weaponized since childhood. The court knew it. The other candidates knew it. And from the way Elira's breathing had gone shallow and rapid, she knew it too. Varion took a step forward, and the entire hall held its breath. Protocol dictated he would walk the line, exchange pleasantries with each candidate, assess their worth like a general inspecting troops. Then he would retire to deliberate with his council, weigh alliances against assets, and select whichever woman would best serve the empire's interests. That's how it had always worked. That's how power sustained itself. But Varion had built an empire by recognizing patterns that others missed, and right now, every instinct honed through a decade of warfare was screaming that something in this room didn't fit. His boots echoed against marble as he walked past Lady Seraphine without a word. Her smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes, calculation adjusting. He moved past Morgana, past Callista, past a dozen other perfectly constructed masks of ambition and breeding, and stopped in front of the girl trying to hide behind a pillar. Elira's head snapped up, eyes wide with something between terror and disbelief. Up close, Varion could see the calluses on her hands, the slight fraying at the hem of her dress, the way her pulse hammered visibly in her throat. This wasn't a player. This was prey that had wandered into a predator's den and realized too late that all the exits were blocked. Interesting. Varion had spent his entire life surrounded by people who knew exactly what to say and when to say it. Every word calculated, every gesture rehearsed. He could smell performance like smoke on the wind, But this girl standing in front of him, trembling like a rabbit in a snare, she wasn't performing anything. She was genuinely, authentically terrified. And in a world built on deception, authenticity was rarer than diamonds and twice as valuable. "Your name," Varian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Alira opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She swallowed hard, tried again. "Alira Vance, Your Majesty." The words came out barely above a whisper, and she immediately looked like she wanted to take them back and try again with more confidence. "Why are you here?" It wasn't really a question. It was a test. Alira's eyes darted sideways toward the assembled nobility, the other candidates, the guards lining the walls, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. My father thought." She stopped, took a breath that shook on the inhale. "I shouldn't be here." And there it was. Truth. Raw, unpolished, completely unstrategic truth. Every other woman in this hall would have lied, would have said something about honor, duty, serving the empire, would have performed humility while angling for advantage. But Alira Vance just admitted out loud that she didn't belong. The court behind them erupted in barely suppressed whispers. Shock rippled through the assembled nobles like a stone thrown into still water. Because in the game of power, you never admitted weakness. Varian felt something shift in his chest. Not sentiment. He'd carved that out of himself years ago. But interest. The kind of sharp-edged curiosity that had kept him alive through a dozen assassination attempts and 3 civil wars. He turned to his high counselor, Lord Malus, who stood off to the side with the expression of a man watching a perfectly orchestrated plan begin to unravel. Malus was 50, silver-haired, and had served Varian's father before him, loyal to the throne the way a parasite is loyal to its host, utterly dependent and constantly draining. "Counselor," Varian said, still looking at Alira, "I've made my selection." The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear someone's heart breaking. Malus stepped forward, confusion creasing his forehead. "Your Majesty, surely you wish to deliberate." "I don't." Varian reached out and took Alira's hand. She flinched like he'd struck her but didn't pull away. Couldn't pull away. Because when a king touches you, it's not a request. Her hand was shaking in his. Small, rough from work, nothing like the soft, manipulative fingers of the high-born women behind them. Real. "The selection is concluded," Varian announced to the hall. His voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade through silk. "Alira Vance will be my queen." The court exploded. Not with applause, with outrage barely contained by the presence of armed guards. Lady Seraphine's porcelain smile finally cracked. Morgana Kest looked like she was mentally calculating how quickly she could cut off iron shipments. Duchess Callista's face went so pale her white dress looked vibrant by comparison. But Varian didn't care about their reactions. He was watching Alira's face as the reality crashed into her like a physical blow. She wasn't happy, she wasn't grateful, she wasn't even relieved. She looked horrified. Because unlike everyone else in this room, Alira Vance understood exactly what being chosen meant. It meant she'd just become the most hated woman in the Empire. The aftermath of the selection moved with the mechanical precision of a military operation, but underneath the ceremony, panic pulsed like an infected wound. Alira was escorted from the Great Hall by a contingent of guards and advisors who moved around her like she was a package being delivered rather than a person. Their faces were carefully blank, but she could feel their judgment radiating off them like heat from coals. She'd been taken to chambers that were larger than her entire family home. Gold fixtures, silk curtains, a bed that could sleep 5 people comfortably. Every surface screamed wealth and power and permanence. She stood in the center of it all and tried to remember how to breathe. An older woman entered. Headmistress Vex, chief of the royal household. 60 years old with a spine like an iron rod, and eyes that had witnessed 3 generations of palace intrigue. "Well," Vex said, looking Alira up and down with the enthusiasm of someone examining a stain on expensive fabric. "This is going to be a disaster." Alira's throat was so tight she could barely speak. I never wanted." "What you wanted is irrelevant." Vex moved around her in a slow circle, cataloging every flaw. "You're here now. The king has made his selection, and that selection will stand whether it makes sense or not. My job is to make you presentable enough that you don't embarrass the throne more than you already have." Each word landed like a slap. Why did he choose me? Illyra's voice cracked on the question. Vex stopped circling and looked at her with something that might have been pity if pity could be weaponized. "Child, I've served this palace for 40 years, and I've learned one truth above all others. Never ask a king to explain his decisions. You'll either get a lie or a truth too dangerous to hold. Either way, you lose." Before Illyra could respond, the door opened again. A young woman entered, maybe 25, with auburn hair and the kind of beauty that looked sharp enough to cut. She wore the deep purple of the Southern Dominion's diplomatic corps, and her smile was all teeth. "Lady Kess Theron," she introduced herself, extending a hand that Illyra took automatically. The handshake was firm to the point of painful. "Senior advisor to His Majesty on matters of court politics. I'll be your primary instructor on how not to get yourself killed in the next 48 hours. Illyra pulled her hand back. "Killed?" Kess laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "You just stole the throne from every ambitious family in the Empire. You think they're going to send you congratulations cards? The only question is whether they'll try poison, scandal, or a convenient accident. My money's on scandal first. Less risky, easier to deny." Illyra's legs felt weak. She sat down on the edge of the massive bed because standing was suddenly too much effort. Vex sighed. "Stop terrorizing her, Kess. She's already pale as a corpse. Better pale than dead." Kess pulled up a chair and sat backward on it, arms crossed over the back. "Look, kid, I'll give it to you straight, because sugarcoating things is a waste of everyone's time. You weren't supposed to be chosen. Everyone in this palace spent the last 3 months positioning their preferred candidates. Alliances were formed, deals were made, money changed hands. And then the king walked past all of them and picked you." "I know," Illyra whispered. "No, you don't, because if you did, you'd already be running." Kess leaned forward. "Do you know what happens when you disrupt the power structure of an empire? People die. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always messily. And right now, you're standing at the center of the disruption." Illyra looked up, meeting Kess's sharp green eyes. "Then why are you helping me?" Kess tilted her head, considering. "Because watching you crash and burn would be entertaining, but watching you somehow survive would be fascinating. Plus, I like chaos. Keeps things interesting." Vex cleared her throat. "What my colleague is failing to articulate is that you now represent the crown, whether you're ready or not. And if you fall, the king's judgment falls with you. We serve the throne, which means we serve you, at least until you prove yourself completely incompetent." "How reassuring," Illyra muttered. "It wasn't meant to be." Vex moved to a wardrobe and began pulling out dresses. "Now, we have 3 days until the formal coronation announcement. 3 days to transform you from a grain merchant's daughter into something resembling a queen. The first rule, never let them see you weak." "I'm not weak." The words came out with more force than Illyra intended. Both women looked at her with renewed interest. "Then prove it," Kess said softly, "because tomorrow you face the court for the first time as the future queen. And they're going to tear into you like wolves on a wounded deer. If you flinch, if you hesitate, if you show even a moment of doubt, they'll destroy you." Illyra's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She thought about her father, who'd barely looked at her after her mother died, who'd sent her to the selection like he was disposing of an inconvenience, who'd made it clear her entire life that she was the wrong daughter, the one who survived when his wife died, when he'd have preferred it the other way around. She thought about growing up invisible, watching from the shadows as life happened to other people, being overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. And she thought about the moment King Varion's eyes had locked on hers across the Great Hall. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her, not the version of her that was useful or convenient or expected, her. And that terrified her more than any threat of assassination, because being invisible was safe. Being seen meant becoming a target. "Teach me," Illyra said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Whatever I need to know. I'll learn it." Kess and Vex exchanged a look. "Well," Vex said finally, "that's a start." The king's private study was a contradiction. Simultaneously, the most secure room in the palace and the place where Varion Thorn felt most exposed. He stood at the window overlooking the capital, hands clasped behind his back, watching torchlight flicker across the city below. From here, the empire looked peaceful, orderly, a lie rendered in stone and firelight. You've created a significant problem. Varion didn't turn. He recognized Lord Maelis's voice, could picture the old counselor's expression without looking, concern carefully layered over ambition. Have I? The selection was meant to solidify alliances. Lady Seraphine would have brought the Valdris military network. Lady Morgana controlled eastern resources. Even Duchess Callista, for all her rumored indiscretions, would have neutralized the coastal provinces. Maelis moved closer, his reflection appearing in the window glass beside Varion's. Instead, you chose a nobody, a girl with no connections, no dowry, no political value whatsoever. Your point? My point, Your Majesty, is that you've just insulted every major house in the Empire. They're calling it madness. Some are calling it worse. Now Varion turned and Maelis took an involuntary step back. Because when Varion Thorn looked at you with the full weight of his attention, you remembered exactly how he'd carved an empire from chaos, how he'd put down 3 rebellions before his 25th birthday, how he'd earned his crown not through inheritance, but through blood and brilliance. Let me be clear, Counselor. I didn't choose Elara Vance to make friends. I chose her because every other woman in that hall was a weapon pointed at my throat and wrapped in a smile. I'm tired of weapons. I'm tired of performance. I'm tired of people who tell me what I want to hear instead of what's true. Truth is a luxury kings can't afford. Then perhaps I'm redefining what a king can afford. Maelis's jaw tightened. The nobles are already organizing. Lord Valdris is calling for an emergency council. The Kest family has pulled their ambassadors. This selection was supposed to stabilize the empire, not tear it apart. Good. The word hung in the air like a blade. Maelis blinked. Good? If my choice destabilizes them, it means they were too comfortable. Comfort breeds complacency. Complacency breeds betrayal. Varion moved to his desk, where maps of the empire were spread out like prophecies. I've spent 10 years building this empire, Maelis. 10 years fighting, negotiating, compromising. And what have I built? A throne surrounded by vipers who smile while calculating which knife will reach my back fastest. That's the nature of power, Your Majesty. Then maybe it's time to change the nature of power. Maelis was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. The girl won't survive the court. She has no training, no protection, no understanding of how the game is played. They'll eat her alive. Perhaps. And when they do, when she breaks under the pressure or makes a fatal mistake, what then? Varion's fingers traced the borders of his empire on the map. Then I'll know I was wrong about her. But until then, she stays. You're gambling the empire's stability on a girl who can barely speak in your presence. No. Varion looked up, and there was something in his eyes that Maelis had never seen before. Something almost like hope, which was far more dangerous than rage. I'm gambling on the possibility that honesty might be worth more than strategy, that truth might be more valuable than alliance, and that for once in my God's damned life, I might make a choice based on instinct instead of obligation. Maelis opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, because there was no arguing with a king who'd already made up his mind. As you wish, Your Majesty. He bowed stiffly and turned to leave. Maelis, the counselor stopped at the door. If any harm comes to Elara Vance, accident, scandal, or otherwise, I'll consider it a direct attack on the crown, and I'll respond accordingly. Maelis's hand tightened on the door handle. Understood. After he left, Varion stood alone in his study, staring at maps that suddenly felt meaningless. He'd conquered territories, crushed rebellions, united an empire through sheer force of will, but one small girl with honest eyes had destabilized him more thoroughly than any army, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The first court session arrived like an execution date. Elara stood outside the council chamber doors, wearing a dress that Vex had selected, deep blue silk that was probably worth more than everything her family owned combined. It fit perfectly, which somehow made her feel more uncomfortable rather than less. Kes stood beside her, looking relaxed in a way that felt deliberately mocking. Remember the rules, Kes said for the 5th time that morning. Don't fidget, Don't apologize. Don't explain yourself unless directly asked. And for the love of all that's sacred, don't let them see you sweat. I'm not sweating. You will be. The doors opened and the noise hit Elira like a physical force. The council chamber was a circular room with tiered seating rising up around a central floor where she was apparently expected to stand. Dozens of nobles occupied the seats, advisors, military commanders, heads of major houses. Every single one of them had been waiting for this moment, waiting to tear her apart. Elira forced herself to walk to the center of the room. Her footsteps echoed too loudly. Her heartbeat felt louder. King Varian sat on a raised seat at the chamber's far end, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Lord Malus stood and cleared his throat. Lady Elira Vance, you stand before the King's Council to answer questions regarding your suitability as future queen. You may speak freely and honestly. Freely and honestly, Elira thought. Right. Because that had worked so well for her so far. A woman stood from the third tier, Lady Seraphine Valdris, still wearing her perfect smile like armor. Lady Vance, perhaps you could enlighten us about your family's political connections. Which territories does House Vance control? Elira swallowed. None. I see. And what military forces does your house command? None. Ah. Then surely your family holds significant economic interests, trading companies, mining rights, anything of value to the empire? We manage grain shipments for the northern provinces. The chamber erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Seraphine's smile widened. Grain shipments? How practical. Tell me, Lady Vance, when the Emperor of Draxus sends ambassadors to negotiate trade agreements, will you discuss the finer points of wheat distribution? More laughter. Elira felt heat crawling up her neck. From his seat, Varian remained perfectly still, watching, waiting. Don't apologize, Kess had said. Don't explain yourself. But Elira wasn't built for this kind of combat. She didn't have sharp words or political training. All she had was the truth. You're right, she said, and the laughter died. I don't have political connections. I don't command armies. My family isn't important. Seraphine's eyes glittered with victory. But I do understand grain shipments, Elira's voice grew steadier. I understand supply chains. I understand what happens when winter hits early and the northern provinces run short. I understand that armies march on their stomachs and empires collapse when their people starve. So yes, Lady Valdris, I'll discuss wheat distribution with the Emperor of Draxus if that's what keeps our people fed. Silence. Someone in the upper tier shifted uncomfortably. Seraphine's smile had frozen on her face. Lord Malus cleared his throat. A practical perspective. However, I have a question. The voice came from the second tier. General Kael Thorne, commander of the Southern Armies. 50 years old, scarred across the left side of his face from a border skirmish a decade ago. Lady Vance, if the king commands you to attend a state dinner where you'll be seated beside ambassadors from hostile territories, what do you do? Elira turned to face him. I attend. Even knowing you're not trained in diplomacy, knowing one wrong word could insult a foreign power? Yes. Why? The question hung in the air. Elira looked at Varian, who was leaning forward slightly now, actually interested. Because the king commanded it, she said simply. And because I'd rather make a mistake trying than refuse because I'm afraid. Kael nodded slowly. A soldier's answer. Is it? Elira hadn't meant it to sound like a challenge, but it came out that way. It is. Most nobles would have given me a speech about careful consideration and weighing options. But soldiers know that sometimes you just have to move forward, even when the ground ahead looks bad. He sat back down, and Elira realized she'd just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. But the chamber wasn't done with her yet. Lord Caius Vex, no relation to Headmistress Vex, unfortunately, stood from the top tier. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of handsome face that had probably gotten him out of trouble his entire life. Lady Vance, there are rumors, unfounded, I'm sure, that you lack the refinement expected of a queen, that you've never attended a formal ball, never studied court etiquette, never even learned to dance properly. That's true. Caius blinked. You're admitting it? Why would I lie? You already know the answer. But surely you understand that a queen must represent the empire with grace and sophistication. Must she? Alira cut him off, and the chamber went dead silent. Because you didn't interrupt nobility. But Alira was too tired, too scared, and too angry to care about rules anymore. I've spent the last 3 days being told what a queen must be. Must be poised, must be educated, must be beautiful, must be politically connected, must be a dozen different things that all add up to one simple truth. I must be someone I'm not. She turned slowly, addressing the entire chamber now instead of just Caius. You're right, I can't dance. I don't know which fork to use at a state dinner. I've never negotiated a treaty or hosted foreign dignitaries, but I know what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be told my entire life that I don't matter. Her voice was shaking now, but not from fear, from rage. And maybe that's exactly why the king chose me. Because I see people you don't even notice. The servants who clean your chambers, the farmers who grow your food, the soldiers who die in your wars. I see them because I was one of them. And if that makes me unsuitable to be queen, then maybe the problem isn't with me. The silence that followed was absolute. Varion stood. Every head in the chamber turned toward him like flowers tracking the sun. The council is dismissed, he said quietly. Lord Malus stepped forward. Your Majesty, we haven't completed. I said dismissed. The tone left no room for argument. The nobles filed out, shooting looks at Alira that ranged from shock to fury to something that might have been respect. When the chamber finally emptied, only 3 people remained. Varion, Alira, and Kess, who was leaning against the wall looking like she'd just watched the best show of her life. Varion descended from his seat and walked toward Alira with slow, measured steps. She stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. He stopped directly in front of her. Close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes wasn't solid. It had flecks of darker storm mixed in. That was either very brave or very stupid, he said. Alira's hands were shaking. Probably both. The court will use that speech against you. They'll say you're disrespectful, ungrateful, unsuited for the crown. I know. They'll tear you apart for it. I know. Varian studied her face for a long moment. Then, impossibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Good, he said. Let them try. He turned and walked toward the exit, then paused at the doorway. Alira. It was the first time he'd used her name directly. She looked up. You asked Lady Valderus why I chose you. Would you like to know the real answer? Her throat was too dry to speak. She nodded. Varion's eyes locked on hers, and for just a moment the king disappeared. What remained was just a man who looked very, very tired. Because everyone else in that room would have told me what I wanted to hear, but you're the only one who might tell me what I need to know. And that, he paused, that's worth more than all the political connections in the empire. Then he was gone, leaving Alira standing in the empty council chamber with her heart hammering and her mind racing. Kess pushed off the wall and walked over, shaking her head. Well, she said, you're either going to change this empire or destroy yourself trying, possibly both. I don't want to change anything, Alira whispered. I just want to survive. Then you're in the wrong place, kid, because survival and truth don't usually live in the same house, and you just chose truth. Kess headed for the exit, then looked back. For what it's worth. That was the most interesting council session I've seen in 5 years. Try not to get assassinated before tomorrow. I want to see what you do next. Alone in the chamber, Alira finally let herself shake. She'd survived the first test, but she had a terrible feeling that the real war hadn't even started yet. And somewhere in the palace, in rooms she'd never seen, powerful people were already planning her destruction. But 3 days later, the attempt came at midnight. Alira woke to the sound of footsteps outside her chamber door. Too many, too quiet. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness. For a heartbeat, she considered screaming, calling for guards, playing the helpless victim. Then she remembered Kess's words, "Never let them see you weak." She rolled out of bed silently, grabbed the only weapon within reach, a heavy brass candlestick, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door. The lock clicked. The door eased open. 2 figures slipped inside, shadows moving with professional precision. Assassins. Alira's mind went blank with terror, then suddenly, brutally clear. She'd spent her entire life invisible. She knew how to move without being noticed. The first assassin moved toward the bed. The second stayed by the door, watching. Alira waited until the first one reached for where she should have been sleeping. Then she swung the candlestick with every ounce of strength she had. It connected with the assassin's skull, with a sound like a hammer on wood. The figure dropped. The second assassin spun toward her, blade flashing in the darkness. Alira screamed, not for help, but raw fury. The assassin lunged. She threw herself sideways, felt the blade slice past her ribs, hit the floor rolling. The chamber door crashed open, guards flooded in, and suddenly the room was chaos, steel clashing, someone shouting orders, blood on marble floors. When the torches flared to life, Alira was standing in the corner, candlestick still gripped in white-knuckled hands, breathing like she'd just run a mile. One assassin was dead on the floor. The other was pinned by 3 guards, mask ripped off to reveal a face Alira didn't recognize. But Varion clearly did. The king stood in the doorway, still pulling on his shirt, eyes locked on the captured assassin with an expression that could freeze blood. "Captain Ryden," he said softly, "member of my personal guard, sworn to protect the crown." The man's face went gray. "Who sent you?" Silence. Varion's hand moved to the sword at his side. "I'll ask once more. Who sent you?" Ryden's eyes darted to Alira, then back to the king, and smiled. "You've already lost, your majesty. You just don't know it yet." Then he bit down hard on something in his mouth. Poison. He was dead before he hit the floor. The chamber went silent except for Alira's ragged breathing. Varion crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her shoulders, eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" Alira couldn't speak, could barely think. She just shook her head. Varion's hands tightened on her shoulders, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his eyes that looked like fear. Not for himself, for her. "Get Kess," he snapped at the guards. "And Malus, now." Then softer, to Alira. "You're safe. I've got you." But they both knew that was a lie, because Captain Ryden's final words echoed in the bloody chamber like a prophecy. "You've already lost." Someone inside the palace, someone close enough to command the king's own guards, had just tried to kill the future queen. And if they'd failed once, they wouldn't fail twice. The real war had begun, and Alira Vance, invisible, unwanted, unprepared, was standing at its center. The blood on the marble floor wasn't drying fast enough. Alira stood frozen against the wall, candlestick still gripped in hands that wouldn't stop shaking, while guards dragged the bodies out of her chamber. The dead assassin left a dark smear across the polished stone. Captain Ryden, the poisoned one, left nothing but questions that felt heavier than corpses. Varian hadn't moved from where he stood between her and the doorway, blocking, protecting. His jaw was locked so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Lord Malus arrived first, still pulling on his council robes, silver hair disheveled in a way that would have been unthinkable during daylight hours. His eyes swept the scene, blood, bodies, the future queen pressed against a wall like a trapped animal, and his face went carefully blank, the kind of blank that hid calculations. Kess came next, fully dressed despite the hour, which told Alira she probably slept in her clothes, or didn't sleep at all. She took one look at the room and whistled low. "Well, someone's sending a message." "Captain Ryden was one of my personal guard." Varion's voice was flat, dead, the kind of tone that preceded executions. Vetted, trusted. He had access to every secure area of this palace. Malus moved closer to examine the bodies. The poison suggests premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was planned. No shit, it was planned. Kess knelt beside Ryden's corpse, studying his face with clinical detachment. Question is, planned by who? Because someone with enough reach to turn a royal guard doesn't work alone. Varian's hand was on his sword hilt, knuckles white. "I want every member of my personal guard questioned, immediately. Background checks reopened. Anyone who's had contact with Ryden in the last month gets interrogated." "That's 36 men, Your Majesty." Malus's tone was careful. "If we start arresting guards without evidence, we risk looking paranoid, unstable." "I don't care how it looks." "You should." Malus straightened. "Word of this attack will spread through the palace by dawn. The court will see it as confirmation that your selection was a mistake, that choosing Lady Vance has made you vulnerable. Elira flinched at that. Made you vulnerable, as if she was a weakness someone had exploited. Varian's eyes cut to Malus with surgical precision. Are you suggesting I made an error? The question hung in the air like a blade. Malus didn't blink. I'm suggesting that perception matters as much as reality. And the perception right now is that you chose an unprotected girl with no political backing, and within a week, assassins are in her chambers. Then perhaps we should focus on finding who sent the assassins instead of debating my choices. With respect, Your Majesty, those two things are connected. Lady Vance is a target precisely because she has no protection. No family with armies to avenge her. No alliances to make her death politically costly. She's... Enough! Varian's voice cracked like a whip. Malus closed his mouth. Here was the truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. Elira was expendable. A grain merchant's daughter with no value beyond the king's inexplicable interest. If she died, it would be tragic, regrettable, but not catastrophic. Not like losing an alliance with House Valdris would be catastrophic. Not like insulting the Kest mining territories would be catastrophic. Elira was just a girl, replaceable, forgettable. Except Varian Thorn was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. And that was the most dangerous truth of all. Because when a king starts valuing one life over the stability of his empire, he stops being a king. He becomes human. And human rulers make mistakes that topple kingdoms. Narrative commentary. Power demands sacrifices. Every ruler learns this lesson early, that individual lives must be weighed against collective survival. That sentiment is a luxury purchased with other people's blood. But here stood a king who'd built an empire through ruthless calculation, and for the first time in a decade, his calculations were failing. Because you can't quantify the value of someone who makes you feel less alone. You can't strategize around the one person who doesn't perform loyalty, who simply offers it. And that inability to measure, to control, to predict, that's what made Varian Thorn more afraid than any assassin's blade. Kess stood, wiping her hands on her pants. We need to move her. These chambers are compromised. She stays here. Varian's tone allowed no argument. That's insane. Someone just tried to kill her in this room. And if we move her, we show fear. We show that the attack succeeded in disrupting our plans. No, she stays. But the guard gets tripled, and I want people I personally trust watching her door. You trusted Ryden, Malus said quietly. The silence that followed was ugly. Varian turned to face his counselor fully, and even from across the room, Elira could feel the temperature drop. Are you implying something, Malus? I'm stating facts, Your Majesty. Captain Ryden served your family for 8 years. You trusted him with your life, and he still tried to murder your future queen. So perhaps trusting anyone in this palace is the real mistake. Elira watched Varian's face and saw something terrifying happen. He smiled. Not with warmth, with recognition. Like he'd just confirmed a suspicion he'd been holding close to his chest for months. You're right, Varian said softly. Trust is a mistake. Which is why from this moment forward, Lady Vance's security is my personal responsibility. She doesn't leave my sight unless I assign someone to watch her. And the only people I'm assigning are General Kael and Commander Thessa. Milus's eyebrows rose. Your military commanders. Your Majesty, they have duties. They have new duties, effective immediately. Kess looked between them like she was watching a chess match where half the board had been set on fire. This is going to look like the king is hiding behind his army. Good. Let them think I'm afraid. Fear makes people careless. Careless people make mistakes. Varian finally looked away from Malus, his attention settling back on Elira. Can you walk? She realized she was still pressed against the wall, candlestick clutched like a lifeline. Slowly, she nodded. Then come with me. You're not sleeping here tonight. Where are we going? Somewhere no one would dare follow. He extended his hand. Elira looked at it, scarred knuckles, calluses from sword work, the hand of a man who'd built an empire through violence and will. She took it. His grip was warm, steady, the exact opposite of everything she felt. As Varian led her out of the blood-stained chamber, past guards who wouldn't meet her eyes, through corridors that suddenly felt full of shadows and threat, Elira realized something that made her stomach twist. She wasn't just a target anymore. She was bait. And Varian Thorn was waiting to see who would take it. Yeah. The king's private quarters were nothing like Alira expected. No gold, no excess. Just a large room with stone walls, a desk buried under maps and correspondence, weapons mounted on racks, and a bed that looked like it had been slept in maybe 3 times in the last month. This wasn't a throne room. This was a war room that happened to have sleeping arrangements. Varian bolted the door behind them, 3 separate locks, heavy iron that would take a battering ram to breach, then moved to the windows, checking each one with the thoroughness of a man who'd survived too many assassination attempts to ever assume safety. Alira stood in the center of the room and tried to process the fact that she was in the king's personal chambers, alone, at midnight, while still wearing nothing but a nightgown and someone else's blood. "Sit," Varian said, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace. She sat. He poured 2 glasses of something amber from a crystal decanter, handed her one, then drained his own in a single swallow that suggested this wasn't his first drink of the night. Alira looked at the glass in her hands. "What is this?" "Whiskey. From the northern distilleries. Drink it. You're in shock." "I'm not." "You killed a man tonight. You're in shock. Drink." Alira took a small sip and immediately regretted it. The liquid burned all the way down, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. Varian's mouth twitched. "It gets easier." "Does it?" "No. But you get better at pretending." He refilled his own glass but didn't drink it immediately, just held it, staring into the amber liquid like it held answers. The silence stretched. Alira should have felt uncomfortable, should have been terrified, sitting alone with a king who could end her life with a word, whose mere attention had painted a target on her back that apparently included his own guards. But instead, she just felt tired. Bone-deep, soul-crushing tired. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked finally. Varian looked up from his glass. "Because it's the only room in this palace I'm certain isn't compromised." "That's not what I mean. Why choose me at all? You had options, real options, women with armies and alliances and everything you needed, and instead you picked me, and now someone's trying to kill me, and your own guards are turning traitor, and the entire court thinks you've lost your mind." She hadn't meant for it to come out like an accusation, but that's how it sounded. Varian set his glass down with careful precision. "Do you want the political answer or the truth?" "I want to understand why I'm still alive." "Those might be the same thing." He moved to the window, looking out over the sleeping capital. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, more honest than she'd ever heard it. "I was 12 when my father died, assassinated by his own brother during a peace negotiation. I watched it happen, watched the knife go in, watched him bleed out on marble floors while everyone around us scrambled to declare new loyalties." Alira's grip tightened on her glass. "I inherited a fractured kingdom and a court full of vipers who just learned that regicide was possible. For 10 years I've done nothing but consolidate power, crush rebellions, form alliances. Every decision calculated, every move strategic. I turned myself into exactly the kind of ruler this empire needed, ruthless, untouchable, alone." He turned from the window, and his eyes found hers across the dim room. "And then I walked into that selection and saw you trying to disappear into a pillar, and for the first time in a decade, I saw someone who wasn't performing, who wasn't calculating, who was just real." Alira's throat felt tight. "That's not a reason to choose a queen." "No, it's not. But it's a reason to choose a person." "I don't understand the difference." "Neither did I. Until tonight." Varian moved closer, each step deliberate. "When I got word that someone had breached your chambers, I didn't think about alliances or strategy or what your death would mean politically. I just ran. Didn't call for guards first, didn't assess the threat. I just ran toward you like my life depended on reaching you before they did." He stopped directly in front of her chair. "That's not how kings think. That's not how I've survived this long. But the moment I thought you might be dead, every calculated instinct I've built for 10 years just disappeared. And all that was left was the terrifying realization that I'd started to care about something more than the empire." The words hung between them like a confession and a curse. Alira stood slowly, glass forgotten on the chair. "You barely know me." "I know you didn't hesitate when that assassin came at you. I know you stood in front of the entire court and told them exactly what you thought, even though it could have destroyed you. I know you're the only person in this palace who looks at me and sees a man instead of a crown. That's because I'm too ignorant to know the difference, or brave enough not to care about it. They were standing too close now. Close enough that Alira could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around Varion's eyes. Close enough to realize that the untouchable king was just a man who hadn't slept properly in years. "I'm not brave," she whispered. "I'm terrified." "Good. Fear keeps you alive. Is that what you tell yourself?" Something shifted in Varion's expression. "What do you mean?" Alira didn't know where the words came from. Maybe the whiskey, maybe the adrenaline crash, maybe just the fact that she'd already almost died tonight, so what did she have to lose? "You talk about being alone, about calculating everything, about turning yourself into what the Empire needed. But you're afraid too, aren't you? Afraid that if you stop performing for even a second, everything will fall apart. Afraid that if anyone sees the real you, they'll find something weak, something human, something that can be hurt." Varion's jaw clenched. "That's not—" "It is. I've spent my whole life invisible, remember? I know what fear looks like when people try to hide it, and you're drowning in it." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Varion stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, shock maybe, or anger, or something worse. Then he laughed. Not a happy sound. A broken one. "You're right. I am afraid. Constantly. Every decision I make could topple this empire. Every person I trust could be the one who puts a knife in my back. And tonight, I realized I'm most afraid of the fact that I brought you into this nightmare, and I don't know how to keep you safe." His hand came up, hovering near her face but not quite touching. "I should send you away, back to your family, somewhere safe. End this before it gets you killed. But you won't. No. Because I'm too selfish, too tired of being alone, too desperate for something real in this cesspool of performance and lies." His fingers finally brushed her cheek, barely a touch, gone before she could fully register it. "So I'm going to keep you here, put you in danger, paint you as a target, and try to convince myself it's not the most monstrous thing I've ever done." Alira's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "What if I want to stay?" Varion's eyes searched hers. "Then you're as broken as I am." "Probably." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Then the moment shattered as someone pounded on the door. Varion's hand went to his sword instantly, body shifting to put himself between Alira and the threat. "Your Majesty," General Kale's voice, urgent. "We have a situation." Varion moved to the door, checked the viewing slot, then unlocked the bolts. Kale pushed inside, armor still on, face grim. Behind him, Commander Thessa, a woman built like a siege weapon, scarred and brutal and utterly loyal. "Talk," Varion ordered. Kale's eyes flicked to Alira, then back to the king. "We interrogated the guards like you ordered, found 3 more who knew about the assassination attempt." "Are they talking?" "2 of them, yes. The 3rd took poison before we could stop him." Kale's expression went darker. "Your Majesty, it's worse than we thought. This wasn't just about killing Lady Vance. It was a test." "Explain." "The conspirators wanted to see if they could reach her, wanted to measure your response. They expected you to move her to secondary chambers, increase standard guard rotations, predictable security measures they could map and counter." Varion's eyes went cold. "But I didn't do that." "No, sir. You brought her here, to your personal quarters, which means they now know that Lady Vance isn't just politically significant, she's personally significant." The implications landed like stones in deep water. Commander Thessa stepped forward. "The assassins weren't trying to kill her, Your Majesty. They were trying to confirm how much she matters to you, and you just gave them the answer." Alira felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't just bait anymore. She was leverage. Narrative commentary. This is where strategy devours itself. Every calculation a ruler makes creates new vulnerabilities. Every move reveals something about what they value, and value is a weapon in the hands of the perceptive. Varion had spent a decade building walls around his weaknesses, and in one night, he'd torn them all down for a girl who'd never asked to be chosen. That's the cost of connection. That's why rulers stay alone. Because the moment you care about something more than power, You hand your enemies the knife and show them exactly where to cut. Vaerion's fists clenched. Who's behind it? Kael hesitated. Tell me. The guards wouldn't name names, but they mentioned someone called the Silent Council, a group operating within the palace. Old families who never accepted your reforms, who believe your unification was tyranny dressed as progress. I need names, Kael. We're working on it. But Your Majesty, if this Silent Council is real, if it's been operating under our noses this whole time, then we've been fighting shadows while the real enemy sat at our own table. Vaerion turned to Thessa. Triple the guard on every entrance to this wing. I want eyes on every corridor. Anyone who comes within 50 feet of this room gets questioned. That's going to take manpower we don't have, Thessa said bluntly. We're already stretched thin with the border conflicts. Then pull troops from the border. Your Majesty, I don't care if it leaves the northern territories vulnerable. If we lose the capital, the borders don't matter. Do it. Thessa nodded and left to carry out the orders. Kael remained, looking uncomfortable. Sir, there's something else. What? Lord Malus was seen leaving the East Wing shortly before the attack. The guards posted there said he was visiting someone, but he wouldn't say who. The temperature in the room plummeted. Vaerion's voice went deadly quiet. Malus. We don't have proof, Your Majesty. It could be coincidence. How long has he been my counselor? 8 years. Since before you took the throne. And how many of my decisions has he guided? How many strategies has he shaped? How many people has he recommended for positions of trust? Kael's silence was answer enough. Vaerion looked at Elira, and she saw something terrible crystallize in his eyes. Realization. He's been planning this since the beginning, since before I was even crowned, building his network, placing his people, waiting for the right moment to strike. Vaerion's hands were shaking, not with fear, but with rage so profound it looked like grief. And I handed him the opportunity when I chose you. You don't know that, Elira said, but even she could hear how hollow it sounded. I should have seen it. Should have questioned why he was so adamant about the selection following tradition. Why he pushed so hard for strategic marriage. He wasn't protecting the empire. He was protecting his own power. Kael shifted his weight. Sir, if Malus is the one orchestrating this, arresting him could trigger the rest of the conspiracy to act. We don't know how deep this goes. Then we find out, tonight. Bring him to the throne room. Tell him I need counsel on the assassination attempt. Make it seem routine. And when he arrives, we ask him questions he can't afford to answer honestly. Kael hesitated. Your Majesty, if you're wrong about this, I'm not. Vaerion's voice was absolute. I've spent 10 years reading people, learning when they're hiding something. Malus has been too calm, too measured, too quick to suggest that Elira is the problem instead of a symptom. He wants me to send her away because as long as she's here, she's disrupting his plans. He looked at Elira with an expression that made her chest ache. They thought choosing you was my weakness. They were wrong. You're the only thing that made me see clearly. Before Elira could respond, Kael bowed and left to carry out his orders. Alone again, the silence felt heavier. Elira's mind was racing. What if Kael is right? What if you're wrong about Malus? Then I'll have falsely accused my most trusted advisor and destroyed whatever remains of my court's confidence in my judgment. And if you're right, Vaerion's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Then a lot of people are about to die. The throne room at midnight was a different creature than during daylight hours. The chandeliers were dark. Shadows pooled in corners like spilled ink. And the throne itself, that massive seat of carved stone and brutal history, looked less like a symbol of power and more like an executioner's chair. Vaerion sat on it with the casual authority of a man who'd earned his crown through blood. Elira stood to his right, exactly where a queen would stand, though she'd never felt less royal in her life. Kael and Thessa flanked the throne, hands on weapons. And Lord Malus walked into the room like a man approaching his own funeral and trying to pretend it was a garden party. Your Majesty. He bowed, silver hair catching what little light remained. General Kael said you required counsel. I do. Vaerion's voice echoed through the empty chamber. Tell me about the Silent Council. Malus went very, very still. I'm not familiar with that term, Your Majesty. Aren't you? Strange, because 3 of my guards mentioned it before they died. Said it was a group of old families, nobility who never accepted my reforms, who've been working from the shadows to undermine everything I've built. Guards under duress will say anything. Where were you tonight, Milas, before the assassination attempt? In my quarters, preparing for tomorrow's council session. You were seen in the East Wing. Melis's face was a masterclass in control, but Elira saw it, the flicker. Just a heartbeat of something that might have been panic before he locked it down. I was visiting an old colleague, Lady Marin, who's been ill. It was a courtesy call, nothing more. Lady Marin has been dead for 3 months. The lie hung in the air like smoke. Melis opened his mouth, closed it, recalculated. You're right. I misspoke. I was visiting... Stop. Varion stood, and the movement was so sudden, so predatory, that even Elira flinched. I'm going to ask you one question. Answer honestly, and I'll consider mercy. Lie to me again, and I'll assume every word you've ever spoken was poison. He descended from the throne, each step deliberate. Did you orchestrate the attempt on Elira's life? Melis looked at the king, then at Kael. Thessa. The guards blocking every exit, and smiled, not the careful political smile Elira had seen before, something colder, sharper. You've changed, Varian. The boy I advised 10 years ago would have deliberated, would have weighed evidence, would have considered the political ramifications before making accusations. Melis's voice was calm, almost gentle. But that boy died somewhere along the way, didn't he? Killed by the same crown that's slowly crushing you. Answer the question. Yes, I orchestrated it. Though orchestrated is a strong word, I simply provided opportunities. Captain Ryden had gambling debts, easy to exploit. The timing was mine. The execution was his. Elira felt cold spread through her chest. Varion's hand was on his sword. Why? Because you were becoming unpredictable. Choosing a nobody for queen? Ignoring generations of political tradition? I've spent 8 years carefully balancing this empire's power structure, and you threatened to topple it for a girl. So you tried to kill her. I tried to remove the distraction. Melis's eyes were flat, empty, and I would have succeeded if you'd behaved rationally. But instead, you've proven exactly what I feared, that you've stopped thinking like a king and started thinking like a man. Is that what the Silent Council believes? The Silent Council believes you're a tool that's outlived its usefulness. You united the territories, crushed the rebellions, built the empire we needed. But now? Now you're a liability. Too powerful, too unchecked, too dangerous. Melis took a step forward, and every guard in the room tensed. We gave you everything, Varian. The throne, the army, the legitimacy you needed to hold this empire together, and in return, all we asked was that you remember who put you there, that you make decisions that serve the greater good instead of your own desires. The greater good, Varian repeated, and his voice was soft, deadly. Is that what you call it when you order the death of an innocent woman? Innocent? Melis laughed. She's a disruption, a crack in the foundation. If you marry her, you'll fracture every alliance that holds this empire together. The Valdris family will withdraw military support. The Kesh territories will stop shipping resources. Within a year, you'll have civil war. Then I'll fight a civil war. For what? For her? Varian looked at Elira, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Yes. The single word fell like a hammer. Melis shook his head slowly. Then you've already lost. Because the moment a king chooses one life over millions, he stops being a king. He becomes a tyrant, and tyrants always fall. Maybe. Varian drew his sword in one smooth motion. But I'll fall standing beside someone who doesn't lie to me. Melis didn't flinch. Kill me, and the Silent Council will strike. You think I'm the only one? I'm just the one who got caught. There are others. In your guard, in your council, in every level of this palace, and they're watching, waiting. Let them watch. Varian leveled the sword at Melis's throat. Let them see what happens to traitors. Wait! Elira's voice cut through the tension. Every head turned toward her. She stepped forward, heart hammering, knowing she was about to either save everything or destroy it. Lord Melis, You said the Silent Council gave Varian the throne, that you made him king. Melis's eyes narrowed. Yes. Then you were there, 10 years ago, when his father was assassinated. Silence. You were at the peace negotiation. You saw it happen. Something shifted in Melis's expression. Illyra's voice was steady now, certain. You didn't just see it, you allowed it, because a fractured kingdom needed a strong ruler, and a 12-year-old boy traumatized by his father's murder was easier to control than an established king. Varian's sword didn't waver, but his eyes were locked on Melis with an intensity that could burn stone. Tell me she's wrong, Varian said quietly. Melis smiled. Would it matter? Your father was weak. He would have lost the kingdom within 5 years. We did what was necessary, just like I did what was necessary tonight. The sword moved, not to strike, to lower, because Varian Thorn had just realized that the man who'd guided him for 8 years, who'd helped him build an empire, who'd stood beside him through every crisis, that man had orchestrated his father's murder and used him ever since. Narrative commentary. This is the moment every child of violence must face. The realization that your trauma was someone else's tool, that the foundation you built your life on was constructed from betrayal, that every victory, every success, every hard-won achievement was part of someone else's plan. And the worst part, the part that strips away whatever remains of innocence, is understanding that you can never undo it, can never go back, can only move forward carrying the weight of knowing that you were manipulated into becoming exactly what they needed you to be. Varian's voice, when it came, was barely human. Take him to the cells. Maximum security. No visitors. No communication. Kale moved forward to restrain Melis, but the old counselor was already smiling. You can't lock up an idea, Varian. The Silent Council doesn't need me. It's bigger than one man, bigger than you, and it's patient. Then it can wait in the dark while I tear this palace apart looking for every last member. Melis was dragged toward the exit, but his voice echoed back. You think you've won, but you've just declared war on the very foundation that holds your empire together. And when it crumbles, and it will, remember that you chose this. You chose her over everything. Then he was gone, and the throne room fell silent. Varian stood motionless, sword still in hand, staring at nothing. Illyra approached slowly. Varian. He didn't respond. She reached out, touched his arm gently. He flinched like he'd been burned, eyes snapping to hers, and for the first time she saw him completely unguarded, lost, broken, terrified. He killed my father, Varian whispered. He helped me, guided me, shaped me, and the entire time he was the one who... His voice broke. Illyra did the only thing she could think of. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. For a heartbeat, Varian stood frozen. Then his sword clattered to the floor, and his arms came around her with desperate force, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. They stood that way in the empty throne room while outside, an empire trembled on the edge of civil war. And Illyra Vance realized with terrible clarity that she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross, because she'd stopped being a pawn. She'd become the piece the entire board was arranged around, and there was no going back. Dawn broke over Arendor like a wound bleeding light across the sky. Illyra stood at the window of Aerion's chambers, watching the capital wake up with no idea that its foundation had cracked during the night. Merchants opened shops, guards changed shifts. Life continued with the oblivious momentum of routine. Behind her, Varian sat at his desk, surrounded by maps and documents, running on maybe an hour of sleep in what looked like pure spite. His jaw was tight, eyes bloodshot, and every few minutes his hand would drift toward where his sword usually hung, a reflex that spoke of paranoia earned through experience. They hadn't talked about what happened in the throne room, about the embrace, about the way he'd held on to her like she was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. A knock shattered the silence. Varian was on his feet instantly, hand finding his blade. General Kyle's voice came through the door. Your Majesty, we have a situation. Another one. Because of course they did. Varian unlocked the bolts and Kyle entered, looking worse than either of them. His armor was dented in places. Fresh blood spattered across his breastplate that definitely wasn't his own. The cells, he said without preamble. Malus is gone. Varion went very still. Explain. Someone hit the guard contingent around midnight. Professional. Fast. By the time reinforcements arrived, 3 guards were dead and Malus's cell was empty. No sign of which direction they went, no witnesses. The guards posted there were people I personally selected. I know, sir. The implication hung heavy. Valerian's fist came down on the desk hard enough to make everything jump. How deep does this go? How many of my own people are compromised? We're questioning everyone who had access to that wing. So far, no one's talking. Kale's expression was grim. But Your Majesty, that's not the worst of it. There's worse? Kale pulled a folded parchment from his belt, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. This was left in Milus's cell, addressed to you. Varion broke the seal and read. Illyra watched his face drain of color. What does it say? She asked. Varion didn't answer, just handed her the letter. The handwriting was elegant, precise. Every letter formed with the care of someone who'd been trained in calligraphy since childhood. Your Majesty, by now you've realized that Lord Malus was merely a steward, a caretaker managing interests far older than your brief reign. The Silent Council has guided this empire through 6 generations of rulers, and we will continue long after your dust. You were useful once, a blunt instrument to crush the rebellions your father was too weak to handle. But instruments that develop consciousness become liabilities. We offer you a choice. Send the girl away. Marry as tradition dictates. Rule as we have counseled. Return to being the king we built. Or refuse and watch everything you've bled for crumble. You have 3 days. The clock started at dawn. There was no signature, no name, just that blood-red seal at the bottom, a circle bisected by a crown turned upside down. Illyra's hands were shaking. They're bluffing. They have to be. They're not. Varion's voice was flat, dead. Malus said they were in every level of this palace. He wasn't exaggerating. If they can extract him for maximum security, they can reach anywhere. Anyone. Kale shifted his weight. Sir, with respect, perhaps you should consider— Don't. Varion's eyes cut to him. Don't even finish that sentence. I'm just saying that strategically, I don't care about strategy. I care about not surrendering to terrorists hiding behind council robes. Your Majesty, they've been orchestrating this empire's direction for generations. They have resources, influence, connections we can't even map. Fighting them could tear everything apart. Then let it tear. Kale's jaw clenched. And how many innocent people die while you make that stand? The question landed like a blade between ribs. Because that was the real calculation, wasn't it? Not whether Varion could fight the Silent Council, but whether his refusal to bend was worth the lives it would cost. Narrative commentary. This is the cage that power builds around itself. Every choice becomes weighted with consequence beyond the immediate moment. A king cannot simply choose what he wants. He must choose what thousands of people will die for. And the cruelest trap is that both options lead to death. Surrender, and you murder your own agency. Resist, and you murder everyone caught in the crossfire. There is no clean answer, no moral high ground. Just blood, and the choice of whose blood matters more. Illyra stepped forward before she could stop herself. What if I left voluntarily? Both men looked at her. What if I just went home, told everyone the selection was a mistake, removed myself from the equation before anyone else dies? Varion's expression could have carved stone. No. Why not? It solves the problem. The Silent Council gets what they want, you get to keep the Empire stable, and I get to stop being a target. You think they'll just let you walk away? You've seen too much, heard too much. You're a witness to Malus's treason. They'll kill you the moment you leave palace grounds. Then put me somewhere safe, somewhere they can't reach. There is nowhere safe. Varion moved closer, and the intensity in his eyes was almost physical. Don't you understand? The moment I chose you, I painted you into this war. There's no removing yourself, no going back. You're in this until the end, whatever that end looks like. Then maybe you shouldn't have chosen me. The words came out harsher than she'd intended. Varion flinched like she'd struck him. Kale cleared his throat. I'll give you both some privacy. He left before either could object. The silence felt suffocating. Illyra wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. I didn't mean, yes, you did. Varian's voice was quiet. And you're right. I shouldn't have chosen you. I should have married some political asset, maintained the alliances, played the game exactly as the Silent Council designed it. That would have been the smart choice, the strategic choice. He turned away, staring at the maps on his desk like they held answers. But I'm so tired of smart choices. I'm tired of calculating everything, tired of treating people like chess pieces, tired of waking up every morning knowing that I'm completely alone in a palace full of people. You're not alone, aren't I? My father's dead. My mother died when I was 6. I have no siblings, no family. Every friend I ever had either died in the rebellions or turned out to be working for someone else. The only people I trust are soldiers who follow orders because that's what soldiers do. He looked back at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was devastating. And then you showed up, terrified and honest and completely unprepared for any of this. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone. Like maybe there was someone who saw me instead of the crown. I do see you. I know. That's why they want you gone. Because as long as you're here, I'm human. And human kings make mistakes. Human kings have weaknesses. Human kings can be destroyed. Illyra crossed the space between them, stopping just close enough that he'd have to acknowledge her. Then maybe you need to stop being a king for 5 minutes and be a human, because humans are allowed to fight for what they care about without calculating the cost first. Humans get people killed. So do kings who sacrifice everything for strategy. At least humans die knowing they tried. Varian's hand came up, fingers brushing her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything about the violence he was capable of. You're going to get yourself killed, he said softly. Probably, but at least I won't die regretting that I never tried to actually live. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. Then the door burst open. Commander Thessa, armor bloody, breathing hard. Your Majesty, you need to see this, now. They followed her through corridors that were suddenly full of guards running in organized chaos, shouted orders echoing off marble walls. Whatever had happened, it was big. Thessa led them to the eastern battlements overlooking the main approach to the palace. What Illyra saw made her stomach drop. An army. Not a small force. Not a skirmish. An actual army, thousands strong, assembled in the valley below. Banners flying, siege equipment being positioned. The methodical preparation of a force that had been planning this for months. And at the front, on a black horse that looked like it had been bred specifically to terrify enemies, sat Lord Malus. He wasn't wearing council robes anymore. He was wearing full military armor, polished to a mirror shine, with the symbol of the Silent Council emblazoned across his chest, that upside-down crown. Beside him, dozens of nobles Illyra recognized from court. Lady Seraphine Valdris, Lord Caius Vex, the heads of 3 major military houses, all of them armed, all of them looking up at the palace like it was already theirs. Vaerion's hands gripped the battlement so hard his knuckles went white. They didn't give me 3 days. They gave me 3 hours. Kale appeared at his shoulder, spyglass in hand. Sir, that's not just the Silent Council's forces. Those are your own territorial armies. The Northern Garrison, the Eastern Mountain Companies. They've been turning your own troops. How many are loyal? The Capital Guard holds about 2,000. The Southern Legions under my direct command are still solid, another 3,000. Maybe 4 if we pull reserves. And out there, Kale lowered the spyglass, 12,000, maybe more. And that's just what we can see. The math was brutal, 7,000 against 12,000, with who knew how many more waiting in reserve. Thessa crossed her arms. We can hold the palace for maybe 2 weeks if we ration supplies. But if they cut off the water supply, that drops to 5 days. They won't lay siege, Varian said quietly. They'll demand negotiation. Make me look unreasonable for refusing. Turn the people against me. As if on cue, a white flag rose from the army's front lines. A herald rode forward, stopping just outside arrow range. His voice carried across the morning air, magically amplified to reach the battlements. By order of the Silent Council, acting in the interests of the Empire's stability, King Varion Thorn is hereby called to account for crimes against the state. Specifically, the wrongful imprisonment of Lord Councillor Malus, abuse of authority, and placement of an unqualified commoner in a position of power that threatens the Empire's political foundations. Illyra felt every word like a physical blow. The herald continued. The Silent Council offers terms. Release Lord Malus from false charges. Remove the commoner Illyra Vance from consideration as queen. Submit to a council review of all royal decisions for a period of 5 years. Accept these terms by sunset, and this army withdraws peacefully. Refuse, and we will remove you by force for the good of the Empire. The message ended. Silence fell across the battlements. Kael spoke first. They're offering you a way out. You could accept the terms, buy time to build a resistance. No. Varion's voice was iron. The moment I submit to council oversight, I'm not a king anymore. I'm a puppet, and they'll make sure I never have real power again. Then we fight. Thessa's hand was already on her sword. We've faced worse odds. Have we? Varian gestured to the army below. These aren't rebels or raiders. These are trained legions, our own people. Every casualty will be a soldier who was loyal to the crown a week ago. What's the alternative? Surrender? There might be a third option. Everyone turned to look at Illyra. She was staring at the army below with an expression Varian couldn't read. What option? He asked. Illyra took a breath. Give them what they want. Give them me. Absolutely not. Listen, if I go down there right now, publicly renounce any claim to the throne, tell them this was all a misunderstanding, they lose their justification. The army has no reason to attack if their demands are met. They'll kill you the moment you're in their custody. Maybe. But maybe they'll just send me away. Discredit me. Make it clear I was never a real threat. Illyra's voice was steadier than she felt. Either way, it removes me from the board. Removes their leverage. Varian grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. I am not trading you for political convenience. It's not political convenience, it's survival. Your survival. The Empire's survival. I don't care about the Empire without you in it. The words fell into stunned silence. Kael and Thessa suddenly found the distant horizon very interesting. Illyra's eyes burned. You have to care, you're the king. Then I'm a terrible king, because right now all I care about is keeping you alive. Even if it costs you everything. Especially then. Narrative commentary. Here lies the fundamental paradox of power. The moment a ruler chooses the individual over the collective, they betray every principle that legitimizes their authority. But the moment they sacrifice the individual for strategy, they lose the humanity that makes leadership anything more than orchestrated violence. There is no resolution to this paradox, no answer that doesn't cost something irreplaceable. Only the choice of which part of yourself you're willing to kill, the human or the king. And the cruelest truth is that neither can survive without the other. Illyra pulled away from his grip. You're not thinking clearly. No, I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years. Every decision I've made since I took this crown has been about preserving power, maintaining control, protecting the Empire. And what has it gotten me? An empty palace full of traitors and an army of my own people willing to tear it down. He turned to face the assembled officers. Send a message to the herald. Tell them we reject their terms. Tell them this throne doesn't negotiate with traitors, no matter how many banners they wave or how noble they claim their intentions are. Thessa stepped forward. Your Majesty, that's a declaration of civil war. I know. We can't win this fight, not with the numbers we have. Then we'll lose fighting for something real instead of winning by surrendering everything that matters. Kael's face was grim. Sir, I need you to understand what you're ordering. If we refuse those terms, thousands of people are going to die. Soldiers, civilians caught in the crossfire. This won't be a clean military engagement. This will be brothers killing brothers. I know that too. And you're willing to accept that cost? For her? Varian looked at Illyra, and something in his expression made her chest ache. No. For the principle that a king should be able to make one single choice based on what's right instead of what's strategic. For the idea that maybe power is supposed to serve something beyond its own preservation. For the chance that an empire built on honesty might be worth more than one built on calculation. He turned back to Kael. Send the message and prepare the garrison for siege. Kael saluted stiffly and left to carry out the orders. Thessa lingered. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I think you're making a mistake. But it's a mistake worth making. Then she was gone too, leaving Varian and Illyra alone on the battlements. Below, The army waited. Elira felt numb. You're going to destroy everything for me. I'm destroying everything for the possibility that there's something beyond this endless cycle of betrayal and strategy. You're just the excuse. That's not better. I know. They stood in silence, watching the sun climb higher. After a long moment, Varian spoke again, quieter. When I was 13, right after I took the throne, there was a minor rebellion in the southern provinces. Nothing major. Just a lord who thought a child king was easy prey. My advisors, led by Malus, told me I needed to make an example, to show strength. So I ordered the rebel lord executed along with his entire family, wife, 3 children. The youngest was 8 years old. Elira's throat tightened. I told myself it was necessary, that mercy was weakness, that a king couldn't afford sentiment, and for 10 years I've carried that choice, justified it, convinced myself I did what the empire required. His hands clenched on the stone. But I never stopped seeing that 8-year-old's face, never stopped hearing her scream when the guards came, never stopped knowing that I could have shown mercy and chosen not to. He looked at Elira. I'm not making that choice again. I'm not sacrificing another innocent person for political expediency. If that makes me weak, if that makes me a failed king, then so be it. But at least I won't die wondering if I could have been better. Elira's vision blurred. You're going to get yourself killed. Probably. But at least I won't die regretting that I never tried to actually live. The echo of her own words hung between them. Then Varian's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a desperation that spoke of last chances and impossible choices. Stay with me, he said. Whatever comes, stay. Elira squeezed his hand. Where else would I go? They stood that way as the sun reached its peak and the deadline approached. And below, the army began to move. The attack came at sunset exactly as promised. Not a full assault. That would have been too costly, too obvious. Instead, something far more insidious. Fire. It started in the eastern wing, where the servants' quarters connected to the main palace. Someone had infiltrated during the day, planted accelerants in places the guard patrols didn't watch. By the time the alarm sounded, 3 corridors were already engulfed. Valerian was in the command center when the report came in, surrounded by maps and officers trying to coordinate a defense against an army they couldn't beat. The messenger, young, terrified, could barely get the words out. Fire, Your Majesty! Eastern wing! It's spreading fast. Thessa was already moving. How many people trapped? Unknown. The servants were preparing evening meals, could be dozens. Varian's mind raced through options. Send guards to evacuate. That weakened the palace defense. Ignore it and focus on the army. That meant letting people burn. No good choices, just variations of failure. Thessa, take 50 men. Evacuate everyone you can. Kael, pull the eastern garrison back to the inner walls. We're conceding that entire wing. Kael's face went tight. Sir, if we give them the eastern wing, they'll have a direct approach to the throne room. I know. Do it anyway. I'm not letting people burn to hold a tactical position. As officers scattered to execute orders, Elira grabbed Varian's arm. The servants' quarters. That's where Headmistress Vex was doing inventory tonight. Varian's blood went cold. Vex is in there? She was supposed to be counting linens. She mentioned it this morning. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, Elira running to keep pace. The eastern wing was chaos. Smoke poured through corridors, thick and black. Guards were already evacuating people. Cooks, cleaners, pages, all of them coughing and terrified. But no Vex. Varian grabbed a guard. The headmistress, did she come through? No, Your Majesty, haven't seen her. Elira's face was pale. She could still be inside. If she was in the deep storage rooms, she might not have heard the alarm. Varian looked at the corridor ahead, a tunnel of smoke and heat, ceiling already starting to collapse in places. Suicide to go in there. But Vex had served his family for 40 years, had been one of the few people who'd shown him genuine kindness after his father died, had helped Elira when everyone else wanted her to fail. He started forward. Thessa blocked his path, hand on his chest. Your Majesty, you cannot go in there. She's still inside. Then I'll send men. There's no time. Move! Sir, if you die in a fire while the palace is under siege, We lose everything. The Silent Council wins by default. I don't care. Thessa's eyes widened. What? I don't care about the Silent Council. I don't care about strategy. I don't care about winning. I care about not being the kind of king who lets people die because saving them is tactically inconvenient. He pushed past her. Alira grabbed his arm. Varian, she's right. You can't. Yes, I can. Stay here. Not a chance. Before he could argue, she was moving into the smoke beside him. The heat hit like a physical wall. The corridor was an inferno, flames eating through tapestries and wooden supports. Somewhere ahead, something exploded. Probably an oil lamp or stored spirits. They found Vex in the third storage room, trapped behind a collapsed beam that had pinned her leg. She was conscious, trying to lever the wood off herself with hands that were already burned raw. Valerian and Alira grabbed the beam together, muscles screaming with effort. It wouldn't budge. Vex looked up at them through the smoke, and her expression was resignation. Your Majesty, you shouldn't be here. Shut up and help us lift. I can't. My leg's crushed. You need to leave me. Not happening. Varian, Vex's voice was stern even while choking on smoke. You're the king. Your life is worth more than mine. Get out while you can. My life isn't worth anything if I spend it calculating who deserves to die for my convenience. He braced his shoulder under the beam and pushed with everything he had. Alira did the same from the other side. The wood shifted. An inch, then two. Vex dragged herself backward, hissing in pain. The beam crashed down, sending sparks everywhere. Varian grabbed Vex under the shoulders. Alira took her legs, and together they carried her through the burning corridor while the ceiling rained embers and the walls groaned with structural collapse. They emerged into clean air just as the entire eastern wing's roof caved in with a sound like the world ending. All three of them collapsed on the marble, coughing, covered in soot and burns. Thessa was there immediately, medics rushing to check Vex's injuries. Varian lay on his back, lungs burning, staring at the ceiling. Alira was beside him, breathing just as hard. That was stupid, she gasped. Probably. We could have died. Definitely. Worth it? Varian turned his head to look at her. Ask Vex. Alira looked over at the headmistress being loaded onto a stretcher, alive despite everything. Yeah, worth it. They lay there until Kael appeared, looking frantic. Your Majesty, we have a problem. Of course they did. Valerian forced himself upright, every muscle protesting. What now? While you were in the fire, the army moved. They've surrounded the palace completely, no way in or out, and they're demanding you appear on the battlements for negotiation within the hour. Or what? Or they start executing captured servants, one every hour until you comply. The words hit like ice water. Varian looked at Alira, then at the ruins of the eastern wing still burning behind them, and realized with brutal clarity that he'd been outmaneuvered. The Silent Council had never intended to win through military force. They were winning by making him choose between his principles and innocent lives. Every time. Until there was nothing left to choose. Narrative commentary. This is how power destroys itself from within. Not through direct confrontation, but through 1,000 small surrenders. Each choice presented as impossible. Save one person or save many. Show strength or show mercy. Hold your principles or prevent suffering. And the cruelest trap is that both paths lead to erosion. Compromise your values and you hollow yourself out. Refuse to compromise and you watch innocents die. There is no victory, only degrees of loss. And eventually, you realize that the game was rigged from the beginning, not to beat you, but to make you beat yourself. Valerian stood, every bone aching. Tell them I'll be there in 30 minutes. Sir, you can't negotiate with them. The moment you show weakness, I'm not negotiating. I'm ending this. Kael's expression went carefully neutral. How? Varian didn't answer. He just walked toward the battlements with the mechanical precision of a man who'd finally run out of options. Alira followed, dread building in her chest like a physical weight. When they reached the walls, the army was waiting. Malus sat on his horse, looking up with the patient expression of a teacher waiting for a slow student to understand the lesson. Beside him, a line of captured servants knelt in the dirt, hands bound, guards standing over them with drawn swords. Valerian's hands gripped the battlement. Maelis's voice carried across the distance, that same magical amplification making every word crystal clear. Well, Your Majesty, have you reconsidered our generous terms? I have. And? Valerian took a breath. Illyra could see the war happening behind his eyes, every instinct screaming different directions, every principle crashing against reality. I accept, Varian said, and the words sounded like they cost him everything. On two conditions. Maelis smiled. We're listening. First, the servants you're holding get released unharmed, all of them, immediately. Agreed. And second, Illyra Vance gets safe passage out of the capital, unmolested, unharmed, with enough resources to start a life somewhere far from here. Illyra's heart stopped. Also agreed, Maelis said easily, though I'm surprised you care about the girl's welfare after she's caused you so much trouble. I don't care about her, Varian said, and his voice was flat, empty. I care about ending this siege before more people die. She's irrelevant. She was always irrelevant. I made a mistake in the selection, and I'm correcting it. Each word landed like a knife between Illyra's ribs. She stared at Varian, waiting for him to look at her, to signal that this was strategy, that he didn't mean it. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed locked on Maelis. Open the gates, Varian ordered. Let them in. We'll formalize the surrender terms in the throne room within the hour. Your Majesty, Kyle started. That's an order, General. The tone left no room for argument. Illyra's hands were shaking. Valerian. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were cold, distant, the eyes of a king, not a man. You should start packing, Lady Vance. You'll be leaving at dawn. You can't... We talked about this. You said, I said a lot of things. I was wrong. This is the reality. Accept it. He turned and walked away, posture rigid, leaving Illyra standing on the battlements with her world crumbling around her. Below, the army began to move. The gates opened. And Illyra Vance realized with devastating clarity that she'd just been sacrificed, not by enemies, by the one person she'd started to believe would never let her fall. The throne room filled with enemies like water flooding a sinking ship. Illyra watched from the gallery above as the Silent Council's forces poured through the palace gates, not with the chaos of invasion, but with the organized confidence of people reclaiming property they'd always owned. Maelis walked at the front, armor gleaming, flanked by nobles who'd pretended loyalty for years while sharpening knives in the dark. Lady Seraphine Valdris moved with predatory grace, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. Lord Caius Vex looked almost bored, like overthrowing a king was just another Tuesday. And behind them, hundreds of soldiers wearing the Empire's colors but taking orders from someone else entirely. Varian stood at the center of it all, perfectly still, watching his throne room become occupied territory. Illyra couldn't see his face from this angle. Couldn't tell if the surrender in his voice on the battlements had been real or performance. Couldn't tell if he'd actually given up, or if he was waiting. Kess appeared beside her in the gallery shadows, moving silent as smoke. You need to leave, now, before they lock down the palace completely. Illyra didn't look away from the scene below. He betrayed me. Did he? Kess's tone was skeptical. Because from where I'm standing, the king just made a choice that saves your life while destroying his own. That doesn't sound like betrayal. That sounds like sacrifice. He called me irrelevant in front of an army that wants you dead. Yeah. Real mystery why he'd say that. Illyra's throat was tight. You think this is strategy? I think Varian Thorn didn't spend 10 years building an empire just to surrender it because someone set a few fires and waved some swords. Kess gestured toward the throne room. Watch, something's coming. Below, Maelis approached the throne with the casual authority of someone who'd been planning this moment for decades. Your Majesty, shall we discuss terms? Varian's voice was flat. You already dictated terms. I accepted. What's left to discuss? The formalities, the public announcement, the smooth transition of power that prevents this empire from tearing itself apart. You mean the part where you parade me in front of the people and make it look like I chose this willingly? Precisely. Maelis smiled. We're not monsters, Varian. We don't want civil war. We just want the empire guided by wisdom instead of impulse. You've done remarkable work consolidating the territories. We simply need to ensure that work continues under proper oversight. Proper oversight. Varian repeated the words like they tasted rotten. Is that what you call orchestrating my father's assassination? Proper oversight? The throne room went silent. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Even the nobles looked uneasy. Melis's expression didn't change. Your father was a complication. We resolved it, just as we've resolved every complication for 6 generations. The Silent Council doesn't serve individual rulers, Your Majesty. We serve the Empire's continuity, and sometimes continuity requires difficult choices, like murdering kings, like preventing weak kings from destroying everything their predecessors built. Varian took a step forward, and despite being surrounded by enemies, despite having surrendered, something in his movement made guards reach for weapons. Tell me, Melis, when you slit my father's throat during that peace negotiation, did he see it coming? Did he know his most trusted advisor was the one holding the knife? Melis's jaw tightened fractionally. I didn't personally— Don't lie. Not now. We're past that. Varian's voice was soft, deadly. You were there. You gave the order. You watched a 12-year-old boy see his father bleed out on marble floors, and then you spent the next 10 years shaping that traumatized child into exactly the weapon you needed. The silence was absolute. You're quite right, Melis said finally. I did all of that, and I'd do it again, because your father was going to fracture this empire through weakness and sentiment. You, on the other hand, were malleable, capable, perfect for our purposes. He spread his hands, almost apologetic, until you developed a conscience. That was unfortunate. Narrative commentary. Here is the terrible truth about power structures that span generations. They don't need individual loyalty. They need systems, mechanisms that function regardless of who occupies the throne. A king is just a face placed on an institution that existed before him and will continue after he's dust. And the cruelest realization is understanding that everything you built, every victory you claimed, every decision you thought was yours, it was all part of someone else's design. You were never the architect. You were just another brick in a wall that's been rising for centuries. Varian's hands clenched at his sides. So what happens now? You put me in a cage? Execute me quietly? Make it look like an accident? Nothing so crude. Melis gestured to the assembled nobles. We need you alive. Need you to maintain appearances while we guide policy. You'll remain king in name. We'll simply ensure your decisions serve the Empire's actual interests instead of your personal whims. You mean I become a puppet? We prefer the term constitutional monarch. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to remove you, install someone more cooperative. Perhaps Lady Seraphine would make an excellent empress. Or Lord Caius. We have options. Melis stepped closer, voice dropping to something almost kind. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Varian. You've fought well. You've proven your strength. But this is a war you cannot win. The Silent Council has roots deeper than your reign, connections you can't sever, resources you can't match. Surrender with dignity. Live. Continue your father's bloodline under our guidance. That's the best outcome available. Varian looked at Melis for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not the cold political smile of a king. Something wilder, more dangerous. You're right about one thing. This is a war I can't win through traditional means, so I'm not going to try. He raised his voice, addressing the entire throne room. General Kale, execute contingency protocol Omega. Kale, standing near the rear entrance, saluted sharply and disappeared through a side corridor. Melis's eyes narrowed. What did you just order? Varian turned back to him, and the smile widened. I'm burning it all down. The words hung in the air for one frozen heartbeat. Then chaos erupted. Explosions rocked the palace foundations, not random, but precisely placed. The throne room's eastern wall cracked, stone raining down. Soldiers scattered as support columns began to groan under structural failure. Melis grabbed Varian's collar. What have you done? Varian's voice was perfectly calm. Protocol Omega. If the palace is ever compromised beyond recovery, collapse the entire eastern wing. Bury the armory, the treasury, the council chambers, everything the Silent Council would need to maintain control. It's all coming down. You're insane. We're still inside. Then you'd better run. Another explosion closer this time. The ceiling began to crack. Malus released Varion and sprinted for the exit, nobles and soldiers following in a panicked stampede. But Varion didn't move. He stood perfectly still in the center of the collapsing throne room, watching his empire destroy itself. Above in the gallery, Illyra realized what he was doing. He's going to die here. Let the palace collapse on top of him rather than surrender. Kess grabbed her arm. Then we need to move. Now. Illyra pulled free. I'm not leaving him. He literally just orchestrated his own death. What exactly do you think you can do? Stop him from being an idiot. She was running before Kess could argue, taking stairs 3 at a time, dodging falling debris. The throne room was nearly empty now, just Varion standing alone while the ceiling rained stone and the walls began their slow, inexorable collapse. Illyra burst through the main doors and sprinted toward him. He saw her coming and his expression cracked, genuine horror breaking through the calm. What are you doing? Get out! Not without you! I ordered the collapse. I'm staying to make sure it finishes. Then you're stupider than Malus said. She grabbed his arm, trying to drag him toward the exit. Varion didn't budge. If I leave, the Silent Council survives. They'll regroup, find another puppet, continue controlling the Empire. This is the only way to break their power permanently. By killing yourself? If that's what it takes. A massive chunk of ceiling crashed down 10 feet away, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Illyra's eyes burned. This isn't strength. This is giving up. No. This is the only real choice I have left. Let the Empire see that I'd rather die than serve them. Let that be my final act as king. You're not a king anymore. You're just a man about to make the same mistake your father made, dying while the people who caused the problem walk away. That hit home. Varion's jaw clenched. My father died because he trusted the wrong people, and you're dying because you've forgotten how to trust anyone at all. Another explosion. The floor cracked beneath their feet. Illyra stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat coming off Varion's armored chest, close enough to see the exhaustion and desperation carved into every line of his face. You told me you were tired of being alone. You said I made you feel human again. Was that a lie? No. Then stop trying to die like a king and start trying to live like a human. Because humans fight for what matters even when the odds are impossible. The ceiling groaned, structural failure imminent. Varion looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. You should hate me. I called you irrelevant. I know why you did it. Do you? You were protecting me, making sure the Silent Council saw me as worthless so they'd let me go instead of killing me. Her voice cracked. It was probably the kindest thing anyone's ever done for me, even if it felt like dying. Varion's hand came up, cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted the violence collapsing around them. I don't know how to do this. How to be a king and a human at the same time. Then stop trying to be a king. Just be a man who survives because someone gave him a reason to. The throne itself collapsed, stone throne shattering into rubble. Varion grabbed Illyra's hand and ran. They sprinted through corridors filled with smoke and falling debris, past guards evacuating, past nobles fleeing for their lives. The palace was eating itself, centuries of architecture succumbing to precisely placed explosives designed for exactly this scenario. They emerged into the main courtyard just as the eastern wing's final supports gave way. The collapse was biblical, stone and marble and gold all crashing down in a wave of destruction that sent dust clouds billowing across the capital. Varion and Illyra hit the ground as the shockwave passed over them, ears ringing, lungs filled with grit. When the dust settled enough to see, the palace of Arendor, symbol of imperial power for 200 years, was half ruins. And standing in the wreckage, covered in dust but very much alive, was Varion Thorn. Malus stood across the courtyard, armor dented, face twisted with rage. You destroyed your own seat of power. You've lost everything. Varion rose slowly, helping Illyra to her feet. No, I destroyed the symbol. The Empire was never the palace. It was never the throne. It was never the careful structures you built to control it. Then what is it? Varian looked at Illyra, then at the soldiers emerging from the rubble. His soldiers, the ones loyal to him, not to councils or conspiracies. The Empire is the people willing to stand when everything falls apart, and I've got more of those than you do. Malus's hand went to his sword. You're bluffing. Half your forces defected. Your palace is rubble. You have no base of power left. I have the truth. Varion's voice carried across the courtyard, reaching soldiers on both sides. I have the fact that you murdered my father, that you've been manipulating this empire for generations, that every noble standing beside you is complicit in treason spanning decades. He pointed at Malus, and the gesture was an accusation that couldn't be ignored. So here's what happens now. You surrender. Submit to trial. Face justice for every crime you've committed. Or we settle this the old way. Single combat, no interference, winner takes command of whatever's left. Narrative commentary. This is the moment systems fear most. When the individual refuses to play by the rules that sustain institutional power. When someone looks at centuries of careful orchestration and says, no, I'd rather burn it all down than participate in this lie, because systems depend on participation, on everyone agreeing that the game matters more than the truth. And when someone stops caring about the game, when they're willing to sacrifice everything, including themselves, the system has no response except violence. And violence, at least, is honest. Malus stared at Varion like he was looking at a stranger. You're serious, completely. You could die. Probably will. I've trained for combat since childhood. You're exhausted, injured, barely standing. All true. Varion drew his sword anyway. But I'm also done pretending this empire works anyway except through force. So let's strip away the politics and the councils and the careful words. Let's settle it like our ancestors did, with steel and blood and the understanding that one of us isn't walking away. Around them, soldiers from both sides formed a circle without needing orders, because this was primal. This was the foundation underneath all the ceremony and structure. This was power at its most raw. Malus drew his own blade, longer and heavier than Varion's. So be it. When I kill you, the Silent Council's authority becomes absolute. Every soldier here witnesses that we defeated you fairly. No more questions, no more resistance. And when I kill you, Varion countered, every connection you have dies with you. Every conspiracy unravels. Every noble complicit in this scheme loses their shield. It all ends here. Agreed. They circled each other, boots crunching on rubble. Alira wanted to scream, to stop this, to find some other way. But Kess appeared beside her, hand on her shoulder. This has to happen. Let it. He's exhausted. He can barely stand. I know, but look at his eyes. Alira looked and saw something that made her breath catch. Varion wasn't afraid. He was free. For the first time since she'd met him, the weight of the crown was gone. The calculations were silent. The endless strategy had ceased. All that remained was a man who'd finally run out of fucks to give and discovered that liberation felt a lot like rage. Malus attacked first, a testing strike, probing defenses. Varion parried lazily, barely moving. Malus pressed harder, blade work precise and textbook perfect. Varion defended with minimal effort, letting Malus tire himself, because Malus fought like a duelist. Technical, controlled, following the rules of engagement taught in military academies. But Varion had learned to fight in actual war, where there were no rules. Malus lunged, overcommitting to a thrust that should have ended it. Varion sidestepped, grabbed Malus's wrist, and twisted. Bone cracked audibly. Malus screamed, blade falling from nerveless fingers. Varion kicked him in the chest, sending him sprawling. The old counselor hit the ground hard, gasping. Varion stood over him, sword leveled at his throat. The courtyard was silent except for Malus's ragged breathing. Do it, Malus spat. Kill me. Make yourself the murderer. Prove that you're no different than the systems you claim to oppose. Varion's blade didn't waver. You're right. Killing you makes me exactly what you are. A man willing to end lives for political convenience. Then what's stopping you? Nothing, except the realization that I don't want to be you anymore. He lowered the sword. Malus's eyes widened in shock. Varion raised his voice, addressing everyone in the courtyard. Lord Malus is guilty of treason, murder, and conspiracy spanning decades. But I won't execute him. I won't become the kind of ruler who solves problems through execution. Instead, he stands trial, public, transparent, every crime documented, every co-conspirator named. Let the Empire see exactly what's been done in their name. He looked down at Malus, and let history judge whether I was strong enough to choose mercy over vengeance. Soldiers moved forward to restrain Malus. The old counselor looked up at Varian with something like respect mixed with hatred. You just made a mistake, boy. Mercy is weakness, and weakness gets you killed. Maybe. But at least I'll die knowing I tried to be better than the monsters who raised me. As guards dragged Malus away, Lady Seraphine stepped forward from the crowd. She'd lost her perfect composure. Her dress was torn, hair disheveled, but her eyes were still calculating. Your Majesty, if I might speak. Varian turned to face her. You have 30 seconds before I have you arrested too. The Silent Council's membership extends beyond those in this courtyard. Even with Malus captured, we number in the hundreds. Nobles, merchants, military commanders. We're woven into every level of imperial power. You can't arrest us all without destabilizing the entire empire. Probably true. So I'm offering an alternative. Amnesty for those who surrender willingly. Full disclosure of Silent Council operations in exchange for immunity from prosecution. We help you root out the true fanatics while the reasonable among us fade into obscurity. Varian studied her. And why would you offer that? Because I'm a survivor, Your Majesty, and I recognize when a cause is lost. Seraphine's smile was bitter. You've won, not through strategy or superior force, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. That's not something we can plan for or counter. So I'm choosing to bend before I break. Varian looked at Elira. She stepped forward, surprising herself. Accept it. Not because they deserve mercy, but because the Empire can't afford to execute hundreds of nobles without triggering civil war. Take the information. Let the small players go. Focus on the ones who can't be allowed to survive. Practical advice from someone who'd been invisible her entire life. Varian nodded slowly. Agreed. But Seraphine, if I find out you're playing me, if you hold back even one name or one operation, I'll personally throw you from the highest tower in what's left of this palace. Understood, Your Majesty. As Seraphine was escorted away to begin her testimony, Kael appeared through the smoke and rubble. Sir, we've secured the perimeter. What's left of the Silent Council's forces are surrendering or fleeing. The capital garrison is holding loyal. He paused. We've won. Barely. But we've won. Varian looked around at the ruins of his palace, the bodies being carried from the rubble, the empire that had just eaten itself alive. This doesn't feel like victory? It's not, Kael agreed. It's survival, which is the best we could hope for. As soldiers began the grim work of recovery, as medics tended to wounded, as the sun climbed higher over a capital that had just witnessed its foundation crack, Varian finally allowed himself to breathe. Elira stood beside him, covered in the same dust and blood, alive against all probability. So, she said quietly. What now? Varian looked at her, then at the ruins, then back at her. Now we rebuild. But not the same empire, not the same systems that allowed all this to fester. Something new, something honest. You think that's possible? No. But I think it's necessary, and I think I can't do it alone. He extended his hand. Help me. Not as a queen. I don't even know if there's a throne left to offer, but as someone who sees what I can't, who calls out the lies I'm too tired to notice, who keeps me human when the crown tries to make me something else. Elira looked at his hand for a long moment, then took it, on one condition. Varian's eyebrow rose. Which is? You stop trying to die dramatically every time things get difficult. We survive together or not at all. Deal. They stood that way as the palace smoldered and the empire held its breath. Two people who'd never asked for this burden but were too stubborn to put it down. And somewhere in the ruins, in the cells where Malus was being held, the old counselor smiled, because he'd seen this pattern before, seen idealistic young rulers try to change systems older than their bloodlines, seen them fail, one by one, as reality ground down their principles and forced them to become exactly what they'd fought against. Varian Thorn thought he'd won. But the game was longer than one battle, and the Silent Council had always been patient, in the shadows of what remained, in the noble houses that hadn't revealed themselves, in the mechanisms of power that ran deeper than any one conspiracy. Something waited, watched, planned. Because empires aren't built or destroyed in a day. They're shaped across generations, and this generation's war had just begun. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, Varion and Elira stood in the ruins of everything they'd known and tried to believe that truth was worth the cost. That honesty could sustain an empire better than lies. That two people who refused to quit might actually change something that had been broken for centuries. Narrative commentary. This is the lie we tell ourselves to survive. That individual courage matters against institutional rot. That one person's refusal to compromise can shift systems designed to crush exactly that kind of resistance. History suggests otherwise. History says the systems always win. If not today, then tomorrow. If not this generation, then the next. But humans persist in believing anyway, because the alternative is admitting that nothing we do matters. That we're all just temporary obstacles to forces that will outlast our grandchildren. So we fight. Not because we'll win, but because surrendering means becoming the very emptiness we're trying to resist. And that's a death worse than any blade. Elira squeezed Varion's hand as the sun reached its peak. We're going to fail at this, aren't we? Varion's smile was tired but genuine. Probably. But we'll fail together. And somehow, that was enough. For now. 3 months after the palace fell, Elira stood in what used to be the throne room and tried to remember what grandeur had looked like. The space was gutted now. No gold, no chandeliers dripping light like promises, just bare stone walls, exposed support beams, and the constant sound of hammers as workers rebuilt foundations that had cracked under the weight of centuries. She'd stopped trying to look like a queen weeks ago. The elaborate dresses Vex had forced her into were packed away, replaced by simple tunics and pants that didn't get caught on debris. Her hands were calloused from carrying stone. Her back ached from long days working alongside laborers, and she'd never felt more herself. Varion appeared from the western corridor, covered in the same dust that coated everything these days. He'd abandoned the crown entirely, literally melted it down to pay workers when the treasury ran dry. Now he just looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in months and was too stubborn to admit it. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Just one?" Elira wiped sweat from her forehead. "I counted at least 7 before breakfast." Vaerion's mouth twitched. "This one's bigger. General Kael just reported that 3 northern territories are refusing to pay taxes until we prove the new government is stable. They're saying the Silent Council's collapse created a power vacuum, and they're not funding an empire that might not exist in 6 months. Are they wrong?" The question hung between them, because that was the brutal reality nobody wanted to say out loud. The Silent Council had been orchestrating imperial policy for generations. With them gone, with Milas awaiting trial and half the nobility either arrested or in hiding, the empire was functioning on momentum and hope. And both were running out. "No," Varion admitted. "They're not wrong. We're barely holding this together. Every day brings new reports of territories considering independence, military commanders questioning orders, merchants refusing to ship goods without guaranteed payment. So what do we do?" Varion looked around at the gutted throne room, at the workers rebuilding piece by piece. "We keep building. We prove that an empire based on honesty can survive, even if it kills us trying." Narrative commentary. This is the cost nobody calculates when they burn down broken systems. The moment after the fire, when you're standing in ashes and realizing that destruction was the easy part. Building something new from ruins requires a kind of endurance that has nothing to do with strength or strategy. It's the ability to wake up every morning knowing you might fail, knowing the odds are impossible, and choosing to keep hammering stones into place anyway. Not because success is guaranteed, but because the alternative is admitting that the only thing worse than a corrupt system is no system at all. And humans can't survive chaos for long before they start begging for anyone to impose order, even the same tyrants they just overthrew. Kess burst into the room, looking more disheveled than usual. "We've got another situation. Lady Seraphine just finished testifying about Silent Council operations in the eastern provinces. Turns out they've been embezzling tax revenue for 40 years. Millions of gold. Just gone." Varion closed his eyes. "How bad?" "Bad enough that if word gets out, every territory is going to demand reparations we can't afford. The empire will be bankrupt within a month." Elira felt something cold settle in her chest. "Can we cover it up?" Both Varion and Kess looked at her. "What?" Elira crossed her arms defensively. "I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's practical. If revealing the truth destroys the empire, maybe some truths need to stay buried. Varion's expression was unreadable. You're suggesting we lie. I'm suggesting we choose which battles to fight. You can't fix 40 years of corruption overnight. Maybe you prioritize stability first, justice second, and become exactly what we fought against. No. Become leaders who understand that perfect honesty is a luxury dying empires can't afford. Kess was watching this exchange with obvious interest. Varion moved to the window, staring out at the Capitol below. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you, would have calculated the political cost and made the strategic choice. But I'm tired of strategy, Illyra. I'm tired of choosing the easy lie over the hard truth. Even if the truth destroys everything, especially then. Because if this empire can only survive through deception, then maybe it deserves to fall. Maybe we build something smaller, more honest, less grand, but more real. Illyra's throat tightened. You're willing to let it all collapse? I'm willing to let the lie collapse. Whatever remains after that is what we actually have, not what we've been pretending to have. He turned back to face them. Publish Seraphine's testimony. All of it. Let every territory see exactly how they've been robbed. Let the outrage come. We'll deal with the consequences honestly instead of managing them through deception. Kess whistled low. That's either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both. Varion looked at Illyra. You disagree. It wasn't a question. Illyra took a breath. I think you're being idealistic in a world that punishes idealism. But I also think you're right. Because if we start lying now to hold power, we'll never stop. We'll become them. She stepped closer. So yeah, publish it. Let it burn. We'll figure out how to survive the fire. Varion's eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded. Kess. Make it happen. As Kess left to carry out the order, Illyra and Varion stood in the ruins of the throne room and tried to believe they were doing the right thing. Outside, the city prepared for the trial of Lord Malus. The trial took place in the central square because no building left standing was large enough to hold the crowd. Thousands gathered, nobles, merchants, laborers, soldiers, everyone who'd been affected by decades of silent council manipulation. They came for justice, for answers, for the spectacle of watching the powerful finally face consequence. Malus was brought out in chains, looking smaller than Illyra remembered. Prison had aged him. Or maybe the weight of being exposed had finally crushed the illusion of invincibility he'd carried for so long. Varion presided over the proceedings from a simple wooden platform, refusing the elaborate judicial robes tradition demanded. He wore plain clothes, no crown, nothing to distance himself from the people watching. Lord Malus, you stand accused of treason, conspiracy to commit regicide, embezzlement, and orchestration of a shadow government spanning 6 generations. How do you answer these charges? Malus looked up at Varion with eyes that held no remorse. Guilty. To all of it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Varion's expression didn't change. You admit to murdering my father? Yes. To manipulating my entire reign? Yes. To stealing from the empire you claim to have served? The empire I did serve. Malus's voice gained strength. Everything I did was in service to continuity, to preventing the chaos that comes when power changes hands carelessly. You call it murder. I call it necessary transition. You call it manipulation. I call it guidance. You call it theft. I call it resource management. He looked around at the crowd. I am guilty of all the crimes you've named, but I am not guilty of betraying the empire. I am guilty of loving it more than any individual ruler, of understanding that kings are temporary but institutions are eternal. Varion leaned forward. And that justifies everything? The deaths? The deception? The systematic corruption? It justifies survival. Malus met his gaze steadily. You're young, Varion. You still believe in absolutes? Right and wrong, good and evil, truth and lies. But governance exists in the spaces between. In the compromises nobody wants to acknowledge. In the ugly choices that keep millions fed and safe. So you're saying you had no choice. I'm saying I made the choices you weren't strong enough to make. And history will judge whether I was a villain or the only thing standing between this empire and collapse. Silence fell across the square. Varion stood, and every eye followed him. You're right about one thing. History will judge, but today we judge. and we judge you guilty." He gestured to the executioner standing nearby. "The sentence is death, to be carried out immediately." Malus nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this. But before the executioner could move, Illyra stood. "Wait." Varion looked at her, surprise clear in his expression. Illyra's heart was hammering. She had no idea if what she was about to say was right or insane or some combination of both. But she'd spent her entire life watching from the shadows, and she'd learned something about power that Varion, for all his brilliance, still couldn't see. Executing him makes him a martyr. She addressed the crowd, not Varion. The Silent Council's supporters will say he died protecting the Empire from an impulsive king. They'll use his death to justify their next conspiracy, their next shadow government. So what do you suggest? Varion's tone was careful. Life imprisonment. Public. Visible. Let him spend the rest of his days watching the empire he tried to control function without him. Let him see that we don't need shadow councils or secret cabals to survive. Make his punishment his irrelevance. Malus's face went pale, because that was the one thing he couldn't endure. Not death, but obscurity. Being forgotten while the empire he'd shaped for decades moved on without him. Varion studied Illyra for a long moment, then looked at Malus. The sentence is amended. Life imprisonment in the northern fortress. No visitors, no communication with the outside world. You'll watch this empire through barred windows and know that everything you built has been dismantled. He stepped closer to Malus, voice dropping to something only they could hear. And every day, you'll wake up knowing that a grain merchant's daughter outsmarted you. Malus's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing as guards led him away. The crowd erupted, some in approval, some in outrage, everyone with an opinion about whether mercy or execution was justice. Varion returned to where Illyra stood. That was risky. I know. He could become a rallying point for loyalists. I know that too. So why spare him? Because killing him would have felt good. And I'm learning to be suspicious of choices that feel good. She met his eyes. Besides, you said you wanted to build something different, something that doesn't solve every problem with execution. This seemed like a good place to start. Varion's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. You're going to make a terrible queen. Good thing I'm not trying to be a queen, just someone who keeps you from becoming the monster everyone expects. I think you're doing more than that. Before Illyra could respond, General Kael appeared through the crowd. Your Majesty, we have word from the Northern Territories. And? They've agreed to resume tax payments. Apparently the public trial convinced them you're serious about transparency. Kael's expression was cautiously optimistic. It's not total stability, but it's progress. Varion exhaled slowly. Progress. I'll take it. As Kael left to coordinate with other military commanders, Varion and Illyra stood in the central square while the crowd slowly dispersed. Do you think we can actually do this? Illyra asked quietly. Build an empire that functions on honesty instead of manipulation? Varion was quiet for a long moment. No, I don't think we can. Not completely. There will always be compromises. Always be moments where truth costs more than we can afford. Always be people who exploit openness as weakness. Then why try? Because the alternative is accepting that power requires corruption, that leadership demands deception, that we're all just temporarily useful pieces in a game older than our bloodlines. He looked at her, and I refuse to accept that, even if it's true. Narrative commentary. Here is the paradox at the heart of all idealism, the recognition that your principles might be naive, that your vision might be impossible, that everything you're fighting for could crumble under the weight of reality, and choosing to fight anyway. Not because success is certain, but because surrendering to cynicism guarantees the very corruption you're trying to prevent. It's the same choice humans make every day in smaller ways. Believing in love despite knowing it can break you. Trusting people despite knowing they can betray you. Building despite knowing time destroys everything. The courage isn't in being right, it's in trying when being wrong seems inevitable. 3 more months passed. The empire didn't collapse, but it didn't stabilize either. It just continued, messy, uncertain, held together by people too stubborn to quit. Illyra found herself in roles she'd never imagined. mediating disputes between nobles who still resented her existence, coordinating food distribution when harvests ran short, sitting in council meetings where her opinion, once worthless, now carried weight that terrified her. She wasn't good at it, made mistakes constantly, but she learned. And somehow her willingness to admit when she was wrong made people trust her more than if she'd pretended perfection. Varian changed too. The hard edges that had made him an effective warrior king began to soften. He smiled more, slept occasionally, started to look less like a man carrying the world and more like someone who'd learned to share the weight. They never formally announced an engagement, never held a ceremony. But somewhere in the chaos of rebuilding, they'd stopped being king and subject and become something else entirely. Partners, in the truest sense. One evening, they stood on what remained of the palace balcony, watching the sun set over Arendor. The city looked different now, less grand, more real. Construction scaffolding everywhere, new buildings rising beside old ruins, the visual representation of an empire caught between what it was and what it might become. "I was thinking," Varian said, "about what you asked, whether we could build something honest." "And?" "I think I've been asking the wrong question. It's not whether we can, it's whether it's worth trying even when we fail." Elira leaned against the railing. "Have we failed?" "Constantly. We've made terrible decisions, trusted the wrong people, sacrificed stability for principles that might not matter, probably doomed the empire to fracture within a generation. That's a pretty bleak assessment. But we're still here, still trying, still refusing to compromise the things that make this worth doing." He looked at her. "That has to count for something." "Does it?" "I don't know. Ask me in 50 years. Elira smiled despite herself. "Bold of you to assume we'll survive that long." "I'm an optimist." "Since when?" "Since I met someone too stubborn to let me give up." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun touched the horizon. After a while, Elira spoke again. "Do you regret it, choosing me instead of political advantage?" Varian took a long time to answer. "Every day. Not because I wish I'd chosen differently, but because I see what it cost. The instability, the uncertainty, the fact that we're rebuilding an empire from rubble because I refuse to play the game the way it was designed." He turned to face her fully. "But I also see what we've gained. An empire where people question authority instead of blindly following it. Where truth matters more than appearance. Where a grain merchant's daughter can stand beside a king and nobody questions whether she belongs. I question it constantly." "Good. The moment you stop questioning is the moment you've become what we fought against." Elira's eyes burned. "I'm terrified I'm going to destroy everything you've built." Varian's hand cupped her face gently. "Then we'll destroy it together, and build something new from the ashes. And destroy that too when it becomes corrupt, and keep rebuilding until we die or get it right." That sounds exhausting. It is. But at least it's honest. Narrative commentary. This is what endurance actually looks like. Not the dramatic moments of heroism or sacrifice, but the daily choice to keep trying when every metric suggests you're failing. The willingness to rebuild knowing it will break again. The acceptance that nothing you create will last forever, but creating it anyway because the process matters more than the product. This is the unsexy truth about changing systems. It doesn't happen in one battle or one dramatic gesture. It happens across decades of incremental effort, most of which goes unnoticed and unappreciated. The people who actually transform things are rarely the ones who get monuments. They're the ones who just refuse to quit. A year after the palace fell, the coronation finally happened. Not because Varian had been waiting for the right moment, but because the council, what remained of it, finally convinced him that the empire needed the symbol of continuity. The ceremony was nothing like the traditional coronations of previous rulers. No golden throne. They'd melted that down months ago. No elaborate robes. Varian wore simple military dress, clean but unadorned. No exclusive guest list. The central square was open to anyone who wanted to attend, regardless of class or status. And when the time came to crown him, Varian did something that made the officiating priests visibly panic. He handed the new crown, simple iron, nothing fancy, to Elira. The crowd went silent. Elira stared at the crown in her hands, then at Varian. "What are you doing?" "Making a choice." He knelt in front of her, in front of thousands of people, and the symbolism was staggering. Every ruler for 200 years has been crowned by representatives of power. Nobles, councils, the very people who benefit from maintaining the status quo. I want to be crowned by someone who represents the people those systems ignored. I'm not qualified to... Neither am I. But we're trying anyway. Alira's hands shook as she raised the crown. She could feel every eye on her, could hear the whispers starting, could sense the nobles who still resented her existence watching this moment with barely concealed fury. And she placed the crown on Varion's head anyway. He stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the square. I accept this crown not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of responsibility. Not as a tool of dominance, but as a weight to be carried. And I accept it knowing that the moment I abuse it, the person standing beside me will be the first to call me out. He took Alira's hand. Lady Alira Vance is not my queen because of her bloodline or her political connections. She's my partner because she sees clearly when I'm blinded by power. She speaks truth when I'm tempted by lies. She keeps me human when the crown tries to make me something else. The officiating priest looked uncomfortable. Your Majesty, tradition dictates... I'm changing tradition. Varion's tone left no room for argument. From this day forward, the person beside the ruler isn't chosen for political advantage. They're chosen for honesty, for the ability to see what power obscures, for the courage to say no when everyone else says yes. He looked at Alira. If you'll have me, not as a subject, as an equal. Alira's vision blurred. You're asking me to share this burden. I'm asking you to keep me from becoming a monster. Same thing. She thought about her father, who'd seen her as worthless, about growing up invisible, about every moment she'd been dismissed or forgotten or treated like she didn't matter. And she thought about the man standing in front of her, wearing a crown that weighed less than the responsibility he'd just asked her to share. Yes. She squeezed his hand. On one condition, name it. When I'm wrong, and I will be wrong, you call me out just as hard. No deference, no protection, just truth. Deal. The crowd erupted into chaos, half cheering, half outraged, everyone with an opinion about whether this was progress or blasphemy. But Varion and Alira didn't care. They'd stopped trying to please everyone months ago. Now they were just trying to survive each day without compromising the things that made survival worthwhile. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds dispersed, Headmistress Vex approached, walking with a cane now after the fire had permanently damaged her leg. Well, she said, looking Alira up and down, I never thought I'd see the day a grain merchant's daughter stood beside a crowned king as an equal. Neither did I, Alira admitted. Vex's stern expression softened fractionally. You've done well, child. Better than I expected when I first met you. I still make mistakes constantly. Good. The moment you stop making mistakes is the moment you've stopped trying new things. Vex glanced at Varion, who was speaking with military commanders. He's different because of you, softer, more human. Whether that makes him a better king remains to be seen, but it makes him a better man. Is there a difference? There used to be. Perhaps that's changing too. As Vex limped away, Kess appeared, grinning like she'd just won a bet. So, Queen Alira, how does it feel? I'm not a queen. We established that. You stood beside a king during his coronation and accepted a partnership role. That's queening whether you admit it or not. Alira sighed. It feels terrifying, like I'm one mistake away from destroying everything. Welcome to leadership. Kess clapped her on the shoulder. For what it's worth, you're doing better than half the born-to-it nobles I've served. At least you admit when you don't know something. Is that really better? It's honest. And apparently honesty is our new governing philosophy. We'll see how long that lasts. You think we'll fail? I think you'll be tested in ways you can't imagine. And when those tests come, when honesty costs more than you can afford, we'll see whether these principles survive contact with reality. Kess's expression grew more serious. But I hope you prove me wrong. I really do. Because if you can pull this off, if you can build an empire that functions on truth instead of manipulation, it'll be the most impressive thing I've ever witnessed. And if we can't, then at least you tried. That's more than most people can say. As Kess walked away, Varion returned, crown still sitting awkwardly on his head, like he wasn't quite used to the weight. Having second thoughts? Illyra looked at him, this man who'd chosen her when the world said she was worthless, who'd burned his own empire to the ground rather than rule through lies, who'd given her partnership instead of subordination. No, just trying to figure out how we survived this long. Stubbornness. Mostly yours. I think it's mutual. They walked back toward what remained of the palace, past workers still rebuilding, past guards who nodded with genuine respect instead of obligation, past a city that was learning to function without the invisible strings that had controlled it for generations. It wasn't perfect, wouldn't be perfect for decades, if ever, but it was theirs, built on truth instead of deception, on partnership instead of domination, on the radical idea that maybe power was supposed to serve something beyond its own preservation. Narrative commentary. And here, finally, is the answer to the question that's been building since the first moment Varian saw Illyra trying to disappear into shadows. The question wasn't whether choosing honesty over strategy was wise, it was whether it was worth it, whether the cost of building something real outweighed the safety of maintaining comfortable lies. The answer isn't simple, isn't clean, because the truth is that some people will suffer from this choice. Some territories will break away, some structures will collapse. The empire Varian builds won't be as stable as the one the Silent Council maintained, but it will be honest. And in a world built on generations of deception, honesty is the most radical act of all. Not because it's easy, but because it demands you face consequences instead of hiding them. And that, the willingness to face what you've actually built instead of what you pretend to have built, that's the only foundation worth standing on. 5 years later, Illyra stood in the rebuilt throne room and barely recognized it. The architecture was simpler now, less gold, more function, windows that let in actual light instead of filtering everything through colored glass, space for public forums where citizens could petition directly instead of going through layers of bureaucracy. It looked less like a temple to power and more like a place where work got done. Varian entered from the eastern corridor, carrying their daughter, 3 years old, already asking questions that made them both exhausted and proud. She wants to know why we don't have more guards. Because we don't need them, Illyra said, taking the girl from him. We're not afraid of our own people. But the old kings had lots of guards. Their daughter persisted with the logic of a child who didn't understand why adults made things complicated. The old kings had enemies. We're trying to have fewer of those. Do we have any enemies? Illyra and Varian exchanged a look. A few, but we try to talk to them before fighting them. Does it work? Sometimes. Other times we fail and have to try something else. The girl considered this with the seriousness of someone processing new information. Then she squirmed to be put down and ran off to investigate the workers installing new windows. Varian watched her go with an expression that mixed terror and love in equal measure. We're going to mess this up. Raising her, running the empire, all of it. Probably, Illyra agreed. But at least she'll grow up watching us try, watching us admit when we're wrong, watching us choose honesty over convenience. Is that enough? I don't know. Ask me in 20 years. Varian smiled, the real kind, the one that reached his eyes and made him look younger than his years. You stole my line. I've been stealing your lines for 5 years. You haven't noticed? I've noticed. I'm just too smart to call you out on it. They stood together in the rebuilt throne room, watching their daughter explore with the fearlessness of someone who'd never learned to be invisible, who'd never been taught that her voice didn't matter, who was growing up in an empire slowly learning that power was supposed to serve instead of dominate. It wasn't perfect. The northern territories still tested boundaries. The merchant guilds still pushed for advantages. Old noble families still whispered about the days when tradition meant something, but it was better. Measurably, demonstrably better. And that had to be enough. Illyra's hand found Varian's, fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of people who'd been through fire together and come out still standing. Do you ever regret it? Walking past all those perfect political options and choosing the invisible girl trying to disappear into a pillar? Every day. Varian's grip tightened. Because I see what it cost. The instability. The uncertainty, the fact that we're still rebuilding after 5 years. He looked at her. But I also see what we've gained. And I wouldn't trade it for all the stable empires in history, even when it's hard, especially then. Because the hard parts are where we prove it's real, where we show that this isn't performance or strategy or calculation. It's just two people who refuse to quit. Across the room, their daughter laughed at something one of the workers showed her, probably a tool or technique, the kind of practical knowledge that Alira had grown up with, and Varion had learned to value. That's our legacy, Varion said quietly. Not the empire we built or the battles we won, but her. Growing up in a world where honesty is expected instead of exceptional, where truth is normal instead of radical, where power serves instead of dominates. You think that's possible? I think we're proving it one day at a time. Narrative commentary. This is what victory actually looks like. Not the dramatic moment of triumph, not the climactic battle or the passionate declaration, but the quiet accumulation of days where things are slightly better than they were, where the next generation grows up with different assumptions about how power works, where the changes you fought for become so normal that people forget they were ever radical. The greatest revolutions aren't the ones that get remembered in songs or carved into monuments. They're the ones that shift the ground so fundamentally that future generations can't imagine it ever being different. And that shift happens not in years, but in decades. Not in grand gestures, but in daily choices to do things differently even when the old way would be easier. Years continued to pass. The empire stabilized, not into the iron control of previous generations, but into something more flexible, more responsive, more willing to adapt when structures proved broken. Alira never took a formal title, never called herself queen, but when foreign ambassadors visited, they quickly learned that agreements made without her input wouldn't be honored. When policies were drafted, her perspective was sought alongside Varion's. When crises emerged, they faced them together. Partnership, it turned out, was more effective than dominance. Not always. Not perfectly. But enough. Varian's hair started to gray at the temples. Alira found laugh lines forming around her eyes. Their daughter grew into a young woman who asked uncomfortable questions and refused easy answers, exactly what they'd hoped for and feared in equal measure. And one evening, decades after that first selection where everything began, they stood on the balcony overlooking Arendor and tried to measure what they'd actually accomplished. The city had grown, new districts spreading beyond the old walls, trade routes reopened with territories that had declared independence, and then chosen to return once they saw the empire functioning without the Silent Council's manipulation. It wasn't the vast dominion Varion had inherited. It was smaller, less grand, but it was real. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Alira asked. "Future generations. Do you think they'll understand what we were trying to do?" Varian considered the question seriously. "I think they'll get it wrong. Call us heroes or villains depending on their politics. Romanticize the parts that were messy and ignore the parts that mattered. Turn our choices into symbols instead of seeing them as desperate improvisation." So all of this was for nothing? No. Because we didn't do it for future generations. We did it for us. For the chance to build something honest in a world built on lies. For the possibility that truth might be worth more than strategy. He looked at her, and his eyes held the weight of decades together. For the woman who saw me instead of a crown, who kept me human when power tried to make me a monster, who turned an empire into a partnership. Alira's throat tightened. "I was just a girl trying to survive. You were a girl who refused to perform, who chose honesty over advantage, who showed me that power without humanity is just violence with better publicity." They stood in silence as the sun set over the empire they'd rebuilt, piece by stubborn piece. And somewhere in the city below, in conversations they'd never hear, in choices they'd never witness, the foundation they'd laid continued to shift the world in ways they'd never fully understand. Because that's how change actually works. Not in the dramatic moments everyone remembers, but in the quiet accumulation of different choices, different assumptions, different possibilities. The Palace of Arendor no longer gleamed like a weapon forged from gold and ambition. It breathed with the messy vitality of a place where work got done instead of power getting hoarded. King Varion Thorn no longer stood at the center of it all as a ruler who commanded through blood and brilliance. He stood beside a partner who'd taught him that strength wasn't about dominance. It was about the courage to be vulnerable enough to change. And Alira Vance, once invisible, unwanted, unprepared, had proven that the most radical act of all wasn't seizing power. It was refusing to let power destroy the things that made you human. Together, they'd transformed an empire, not by conquering it, but by choosing honesty when lies would have been easier, by choosing partnership when dominance would have been simpler, by choosing humanity when power demanded sacrifice. And in the end, that was victory enough, because power doesn't last. Empires crumble, monuments fall. But the choice to be honest in a world built on lies, that echoes forever.